Well, hello everyone, welcome back to the Drydock episode 270. Now it's part 2, so of course we shall continue with questions from the Patreon Drydock until they run out, or possibly I do. Either way, let's get going. Brad Bargmeyer asks, you visited USS Iowa and seen how small it is compared to the cruise and container ships that come into the harbour next to it. How effective would the main battery guns be against a massive container ship, given that these things don't really have volatile items like magazines on board to cause secondary explosions? They'd still be highly effective, because you've got to remember, yes, there are no magazines, normally, on board big container ships, but they are very, very flammable a lot of the time. They contain, obviously, a lot of fuel. Quite often the containers will contain flammable objects of varying descriptions, and they also don't have any armour or massive compartmentalisation, which means that if a battleship was to engage a modern container ship, it wouldn't be using the super heavy Mark 8 armour-piercing rounds. It would be using the rather more mundane high-explosive rounds. But those high-explosive rounds, obviously, because they have a lot more explosive on board, will blow massive great holes in the side of the ship and have quite the incendiary effect, which means it will then be a race between will the fire burn the ship out from waterline to the top, or will the holes blown by the shells allow so much water in that the thing will turn turtle and sink before the fires burn it all to a crisp. Either way, it's not a good day to be a cargo ship. And also, since the container ships would be slower and basically defenceless, there's technically nothing to stop the ship rolling up. This is the battleship rolling up to point-blank range, loading an AP round or two, and essentially bore sighting down the barrel to take out take out the cargo ship's power plant, because an armour-piercing shell would be quite useful for that. So, yeah, it would do quite the number on a modern cargo ship, just by a slightly different method. Andre de Coult asks, you are a submarine captain in World War II, hunting both merchantmen and warships. At periscope depth, you see a juicy target through your periscope. How do you estimate or measure the target ship's course, speed, range, etc., first for intercepting and then for getting a firing solution? How do you calculate the tonnage for the attack worthiness and the after-action report? What tools would you use, etc., etc.? Assuming you don't have a US torpedo data computer available to you. Well, there are a number of ways, even without a torpedo data computer. If you were aboard a U-boat, for example, you would use some of the tools which you can see on screen above you at the moment. But assuming that you're starting off far away, you would use, to plot your intercept course, data such as looking through your periscope. You'd estimate the bearing of the ship relative to you by what its profile looks like. So is it travelling perpendicular to you? Is it coming towards you? At what angle? And you have to estimate that based on what you can see aboard the ship. And speed at an extremely long distance will usually be a mixture of target identification and funnel smoke. So, and possibly bow wave if you can see that. And you will have, obviously, reference books which will tell you, well, there's a silhouette of a ship that looks like this is probably this, and it'll cover warships and merchant ships, etc. So if you see a silhouette, you'd be like, okay, well, that looks like this, so that's probably this kind of ship, and it looks, from the bow wave and from the smoke, maybe like it's going full speed. Well, its full speed is supposed to be, let's say, 15 knots if it's a merchantman. So if it's travelling at 15 knots and it's on this bearing, and at approximately this distance, because periscope has dials to work out distance based on magnification and focal length, etc., and then you can say, well, in 2 hours it's going to be here, we are here, in 2 hours we can get there, so potentially we can make that intercept, let's go. And that's one of the places where a tool like the one you can see above might come in handy. Then, of course, as the ship gets closer, you can start to make more accurate estimates of its speed, based partly on the fact you'll be able to resolve things in a little bit more detail in terms of funnel smoke, bow wave, hence why people would paint false bow waves on their ships to deceive subs, and possibly even if you can get a good look at the hull, how the wave profile is along the ship's hull, if you know how to work all of that out. Another thing you can do is look at where the ship is and take a note on your periscope. Okay, we are at bearing, arbitrarily, let's say bearing 074.5. Then you start a stopwatch, and after 15, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute, if you really want to be living dangerously, you go, okay, well, it's moved over by however many points of a degree, however many seconds within or minutes within a degree, or by a whole degree, or whatever fraction. You can put your periscope down at that point, and you, again, using the range figures derived from your periscope, you can say, right, well, it's this far away, and it was at this bearing, and now it's this far away, and it's at that bearing. Well, we can then solve for the triangle, and that gives us our speed over however long we observed it, multiply that up into a minute if it's not in a whole minute, and then multiply that up into an hour, and that gives you the speed in knots. So you then have estimate of course and speed, which you can then use to say, okay, well, in another minute it's going to be here, and if we launch torpedoes, the torpedoes will take 2 minutes to cover this distance, let's say, and in 2 minutes the ship is going to be there, so we need to get the torpedoes to actually go over to there instead, but that's going to take them, say, 2 minutes 10 seconds, so we have to adjust and aim even further slightly ahead, and for all of that kind of thing you might use another little dial set, which you can see here. So you can see in this case it has settings for different torpedo speeds, and there is another one with even higher torpedo speeds, and it's got a section for the ship's bearing, and that can solve for you as well. The main differences between these various manual tools is, one, you have to input the data manually on each of the tools to get the different values that you need, and of course once you put that in, you have a fixed set of data, whereas with a torpedo data computer you can put these various values in, and it can obviously read some values from what your own vessel is doing in terms of your speed and so forth, and provide continuous data updates, pretty much like a fire control computer for guns up on the surface. Of course, as time goes on, captains will get more and more practiced at this, and will begin to be able to start estimating an enemy's course and speed just from some observations via the periscope, at which point they just then need to work out roughly where they are relative to the target, and if they already know that, they might even be able to come up with an on-the-fly firing solution, or at least an approximate one, relatively quickly, which is very useful at times, because let's say you pop your periscope up and you see an enemy aircraft carrier tootling past at 25 knots, you're not going to have the time to sit down and calmly and carefully work everything out for the next couple of minutes. You're pretty much going to have to go, okay, 25 knots, distance 10,000 yards from where we are. Okay, that means we need to shoot torpedoes off at this bearing, this speed. Quick, let's make ourselves face in that direction and loose torpedoes. It would be slightly slower than that because you've actually got to tell the torpedo room what you want them to do, but it's the kind of speed in which even basic mechanical assistance is probably going to slow you down a bit too much. Reichswehr Minister asks, how did the galley on a U-boat submarine evolve during the period that the channel covers, and what are or were the implications on the food that was made available for the crew? Well, initially it evolved by coming into existence. If you look at the very, very earliest submarines, like a Holland type, there just isn't the room for one. And frankly, who was going to actually man the thing? There's a very minimal crew, very minimal space, and you're not going to be out there that long anyway. So you would take along pre-packaged food, even just sandwiches. But obviously, as submarines got larger and were capable of staying out at sea for longer, they needed food to be prepared. But even so, the type of food was relatively restricted in terms of hot food, but this still depends quite a lot, not necessarily on the time period, but on the type of submarine that you are on. So, for example, if you were on a Deutschland-class cargo submarine in the First World War, the cooking facilities on that sub, because it's a relatively large vessel, are going to be significantly better than the cooking facilities 20, 30 years down the line on a Type 7 U-boat, which, being considerably smaller and with considerably more people to feed and considerably more warlike equipment to carry, has a galley that consists of an extremely small space. In fact, there are some studio flats that probably have more cooking space than you would find aboard a Type 7. Conversely, whilst it's not the biggest place in the world, what you can see here in the photo is most of the galley of USS Silversides. Now, the galley aboard a Type 7, you could probably fit into maybe 1/4 to 1/6 of this photo, but on Silversides, as you can see, there's a couple of hot preparation surfaces there on the right. You've got ovens, you've got sink, you've got some additional cooking equipment there at the back. Now, of course, all of this is, and refrigeration as well, all of this is dependent to a certain degree on having the power to run the thing. So if you're under prolonged attack by enemy vessels or being hunted by them, so you may be staying underwater for hours or even up to a day, you are not going to be running your galley because you need to save power. But if you're operating on a more regular schedule, maybe you're just surfaced at night and motoring along through the water, then you can run the galley. But even aboard a big fleet boat like the Silversides, there's still a relatively limited amount of space because, I'm pretty sure a number of you probably have larger kitchens than this to feed yourself, your significant other, maybe a small family. This is a galley that has to feed dozens of men. So production capability is a little bit limited. So U-boats and submarines in general were normally supplied with something of a premium on foods because it was recognized as a hardship station, but an awful lot of those foods would be tinned or otherwise preserved foods that could be eaten cold. So tins of ham, spam, sausages, pre-prepared bread, canned vegetables, this kind of thing, as well as a bunch of dehydrated stuff that could be rehydrated. But you would also have things like soups, freshly made bread, as long as the dough and or other ingredients lasted, certain amounts of preserved or refrigerated or even fresh at the beginning of the voyage meat, which could then be cooked and prepared. But a lot of the time, if you look at the menus on both U-boats and allied submarines, what you'll tend to see is that a typical meal might include one or two items that may have been cooked or chain prepared in the case of fresh bread, which makes things a lot easier. And everything else will be either just warmed by proximity, quickly warmed up in an oven or on a surface, or just cold ingredients that go quite happily with the warm ingredients. Or might be stuff that would require a certain amount of cooking but doesn't necessarily need to be fresh at the time. So if you're making breakfast for everyone, for instance, you might not get the freshest out of the toaster toast, but you would get toast. But your bacon, for example, would probably be still warm. And given that there's a wide variety in submarine sizes, both in World War I and World War II, as I said, you could end up in a situation where your menu on a World War II sub may be more minimal than that of a World War I sub. And, of course, it also depends on what is available in your home nation. So, generally speaking, the men aboard US fleet boats probably had the best diet of any submarine crew in the time period that the channel covers. Conversely, even though they had subs that were just as large, if not larger, I personally wouldn't really fancy the diet of a Japanese submarine crew in World War II. Although I suppose if you really, really like rice, that's not so much of a problem for you. R.J. Blaine asks, my husband wants to know the following. Ship's logs are an amazing historical set of documents. Can you elaborate on the history of ship's logs, when the practice began, and the original intent for the logs? For example, were they meant simply to record the captain's decisions and other events that the ship and her crew faced, or were the originators of ship's logs intending for them to become historic records later on down the road? Initially, at least in the more modern context, a ship's log was actually a navigational device, in that the log itself was, in some cases, quite literally a log, a lump of wood, with a bunch of knotted rope that you chucked over the back, and then you would estimate the ship's speed in knots. The ship's log book would be where you recorded the ship's speed in knots, and as long as you recorded that along with some basic navigational data, like, what even as something like, well, we passed Beachy Head and going roughly west and our speed was 6 knots, that would then allow you, when you took another set of speed readings and observations later on, to roughly work out both where you are and where you had been, which is quite useful, and potentially even tell you how long until you got to where you wanted to be. So if by your estimates it was looking like you were going to take another 4 days to reach your final destination, but you only had 2 days of water left, well, that told you you should probably start looking for water ashore sooner rather than later, rather than trying to hang on for your final destination. Of course, as with most things, ships' logs then began to proliferate as ships and their operations got more and more complicated. So as voyages became longer and longer, and ships' owners may no longer be the ones who are actually sailing the ship owners ashore might now want a record of what exactly happened on this voyage, at least the general highlights, and why, in order to account for why is the ship late, why did the ship not make as much profit as it should have done, or where did all this unexpected money come from, or why is that crewman missing, why have you come back with several extra crew, etc., etc. And so the ship's log, as well as being a navigational log, you also got the captain's log, or the ship's master's log, which would record these sorts of information. And then, of course, you'd have a supply log, which would, start off with things like, we had 100 pounds weight of dried meat and 6 barrels of peas and 12 barrels of flour, and each day we ate this much, and so that accounts for the fact that you have in fact used the resources, and this goes back to keeping an account of everything, because otherwise, if it's quite clear from the ship's log that you've been out for 14 days and every day you've eaten 1/16 of the ship's food, well, then there should be 2/16 left when you come back. If there aren't, well, what have you exactly done with it? Did you sell it and pocket the change? Inquiring people who paid for that food in the first place want to know. And that applies equally on warships as on merchant ships. And for merchant ships, of course, they've got to account for cargo. If they lost any, if any of the cargo went bad or was in any way contaminated, all of that has to be accounted for, because over the course of voyages lasting weeks or months, these kinds of things can't be completely committed to memory. And of course, things get more and more complicated. As steam engines come in, you now have an engineer's log, and so on and so forth. But the broad ship's log, the kind of original one, is still essentially course and navigation data, notable events happening on the ship, and observations by the officer of the watch. So they were originally effectively meant to be partly for navigation and partly for accountability of the captain and crew, but they weren't supposed to be originally specifically historical documents except for the owners of the ships in question. But because they record so many interesting observations about the behaviour of these ships, they therefore become historical documents much later on. Sildair on Machine Works asks, you've often talked about how the Regia Marina had powerful guns and excellent optical fire control systems, but rarely could hit anything because their shells were of poor quality. As an old-fashioned machinist and someone interested in the history of manufacturing, I'm curious about what exactly the quality problems were. Were their size and weight tolerances too loose, or were they unable to stay within tolerance? Is there somewhere I can read about the particulars? So I've covered this a few times in various dry docks, but it's probably a good place to collect everything together. The problem was not their fire control. As you mentioned, they have excellent fire control. The problem is potentially one of three things, or quite possibly all three working together in concert. Now, the longest held issue, or the one that's been around in the public realm for the longest, is the allegation that Italian shells and charges did not meet their quality control in terms of their overall mass, which obviously could be a problem, because if you have a slightly too heavy charge, i.e. there's a little bit more explosive in there, then it's going to send the shell further, and if there's a little bit too little explosive, the shell's not going to go as far as you think it is, based on your range tables. And then obviously if the shell is, assuming that the charge is correct, if the shell is too heavy, it won't go as far, and if the shell is too light, it will go potentially further, potentially maybe not as far, it depends on the range that you're shooting at. So of course you could have a worst of all worlds scenario where you have a heavy shell and an underweight charge, which is going to result in the shell going very short for a given value of vary, and an overcharged propellant charge with a light shell, which at short to medium ranges might mean the shell goes way over target. So that's one thing. And it is known that some Italian shell production was suffering from quality control issues. Now, we're talking, to be fair, of variances of like plus or minus 1% or more, but that can make all the difference when you're shooting at 10, 20 miles and you're looking at a range bracket of accuracy or a circular area of probability which should be in the region of 250 to 300 yards. Another issue which has cropped up in separate Italian naval circles is the fact that due to corruption in some areas of Italian industry, it's known that substandard quality materials were being used. So, high quality, high tensile steel, for example, would be substituted for lower quality mild steel, and then the high tensile, high value steel could be used for something else or sold off for a profit. So potentially, maybe some of the ship's guns, although that's less likely because they would have burst, or maybe the mountings, parts of the turrets, all that kind of thing might have been made of substandard steel, which might have then had vibration or distortion issues. And then finally, there's what I find actually to be a relatively convincing article by Bill Jurens and a couple of associates in Warship magazine, where he points out that another potential culprit is actually shells that are too stable. So when a rifled bullet, or in this case a rifled shell, is fired, obviously the rifling gives that shell a spin, and the rate of the spin is determined partially by what the ratio of the rifling is, but also how fast that shell passes through the rifling. And that makes the shell want to stay pointed in a given direction. But obviously you don't want the shell pointing in the same direction that the gun was pointing all the time, because the shell is in a ballistic arc. So you want the shell to be pointing, let's say 30 degrees up. If you're firing your guns at 30 degrees up, you want your shell to stay pointing in that direction. But as the shell crests over the edge of its arc and starts to angle down, you want the nose of the shell to follow that flight path in order to maintain the most stability and the most accuracy, and of course optimal armor penetration. And the problem that Mr. Jurens and his compatriots have identified is that potentially the Italian guns, which were very high velocity, remember, may have actually overstabilized their shells to the point that they would, let's say they're at 30 degrees up angle, but as the shell loses energy at the top of its arc and then begins to fall, because it's still spinning, it's staying at a 30 degree up angle, which basically means it's almost doing a space shuttle style re-entry except obviously the space shuttle has a belly, the shell's just using one arbitrary side of it coming down, and that is a hilariously unstable position in terms of ballistics, which is going to throw off its accuracy. I mean, you might even start to get a Magnus effect going on, so it would start, scrolling sideways. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that at times, Italian shell grouping was not as terrible as at other times, which could be explained by quality control. Maybe we've got a good batch of shells and a bad batch of shells, or a good batch of propellant and a bad batch of propellant. But the Italian guns, particularly their 15-inch and 8-inch guns, the really high-velocity ones, had a very short barrel life. And the interesting thing is, we know what happens not just when you overspin things, but also what happens when guns begin to shoot themselves out, wear out their rifling. We can look at, for example, the 15-inch monitor that was cruising up and down off of the North African coast, this being a British monitor. It shot out its guns, the rifling wore down, and the shells became very unstable because they weren't getting enough spin, and that caused other problems because they would, explode shortly after they came out of the barrel, because they'd just go spinning off in all sorts of weird and crazy directions. So there is a possibility that the extremely poor shooting of some of the Italian guns could be when they have barrels that are either at the beginning of their service life or at the very end of their service life. So either they're overspun and far too stable and therefore scatter everywhere because of the aforementioned aerodynamic effects, or they're at the end of their lifespan and the rifling's almost worn completely and the shells are just going higgledy-piggledy and everywhere. Effectively, you've almost made a smoothbore battleship gun. And bearing in mind that, with a 15-inch gun, it has a barrel life of 120 rounds. That's not that difficult a scenario to end up in. But, interestingly enough, there would, in that case, also be a sweet spot which they could reach. So, for example, with a 120-round lifetime, a battleship might get some new guns, go out and do some gunnery testing. That's going to actually, at that level of barrel life, that's actually going to eat significantly into your overall barrel life. Then you go out and have an engagement, and the shells are still overstabilized. The shooting's awful. You think, okay, that's not really good. Go back, have another gunnery exercise. You now may be 60% of the way through your barrel life. So typically, for most ships, your guns would actually be in, starting to get into poor condition. But then you go off for another mission and you find a bunch of British ships, you start shooting at them, and now, just during that engagement, you might wear through from, say, 40% barrel life remaining to 20% barrel life remaining, but your rifling is now worn down to the point where it's not completely smooth, but it's not giving quite the same amount of spin as before, which might actually now be giving you an ideal amount of spin, and suddenly your CEP is really good. And then you wear out your rifling and it goes all bad again. So, yeah. And it, that, to be honest, that theory actually covers pretty much all circumstances we see with Italian shooting. But it could equally be additional combinations of 2 or 3 of those factors. So the overstabilization almost certainly happens, but whether that's compounded by uncertain shell quality control and or poor quality mountings and so forth, who knows. The reason I've got these pictures up at the moment is because these are pictures of HMAS Perth under attack from Vittorio Veneto during the run-up to the Battle of Cape Matapan. Now, HMAS Perth is a Leander-class cruiser. She's just over 560 foot long total, which is about 187 yards. And what you'll notice is in the picture on the right, bearing in mind each of these salvos is almost certainly a 3-gun salvo from one of Vittorio Veneto's turrets, you can see just about that these shell splashes are actually considerably beyond Perth in both cases. And in the case on the right, you'll notice that you have almost 3 Perth lengths between the shell splash on the left and the shell splash on the right. And that's actually going to be considerably further because Perth is closer to the camera, so she will appear slightly larger. So even being really generous to the Italians, if we say 3 Perth lengths at 187 yards long, that's a spread from a single gun turret, a single turret, not a single gun, of just over 560 yards, i.e. a single one of Vittorio Veneto's guns is showing a deviation that's twice what you should expect from a full 9-gun salvo, and almost 2.5 times as bad as what the batteries of 5th Battle Squadron were achieving at Jutland. And in the picture on the left, whilst 2 shells have landed pretty close together, the distance between the shell splash on the left and the shell splash on the far right is 4 Perth lengths. And again, Perth is considerably forward of the shell splashes. So yeah, this is some pretty awful shooting, at least as far as dispersion is concerned. Eric Van Dooting asks, I'm currently reading Islands of Destiny by John Prados. There is an account of an event which reads as follows. A week later, this being August 31st, 1942, Commander Shichi Tsuneo, I think, I-11, that's a Japanese submarine, took a shot at the Hornet, saved by an alert patrol plane that deflected the torpedo by dropping bombs in front of it. I'm wondering if you might have any further details on this incident, specifically on how close Hornet was to being hit, and if it was actually a spread of torpedoes, but this was the only one which seemed to be a threat. So, due to the slightly fragmentary records of both sides, it's a little bit difficult to determine exactly how close Hornet was to being hit. But, hypothetically, from the way I've read the records, I think it's actually very likely that the pilot in question saved the ship. The records from I-11 show that she actually fired a spread of 4 torpedoes, and that was actually shot at an incredibly close range for a submarine engagement at just over 750 yards. So there wasn't a huge amount of time either for the torpedoes to spread or for anything to take place in terms of corrective action on behalf of Hornet. So if she had been hit, she probably would have been hit by multiple torpedoes. And of course, these would have been the submarine versions of derivatives of the Long Lance. Now, according to Hornet's logs, what happened is an Avenger was up in the sky patrolling and actually saw a potentially conning tower or something like that dropping beneath the waves or just passing beneath the waves, which would be consistent with I-11 having obviously just popped up and gone, oh look, a carrier, or potentially could have seen a torpedo porpoising. Either way. But whatever the case, the Avenger pilot decided he was going to drop a bomb or depth charge on it. The accounts are slightly varying as to exactly what it was, but some kind of airborne explosive. And according to Hornet's records, that seems to have destroyed 2 torpedoes, one after the other, very quickly, which would that would actually correlate with I-11, which I-11 heard 2 large explosions. So 2 torpedoes going off, full warhead, 2 large explosions heard, pretty much all seems to add up. There was another torpedo spotted, and Hornet had to put the rudder right over to try and avoid it, and by so doing managed to avoid being hit by that torpedo by, according to their estimate, about 400 yards. Now, there's a couple of interesting factors there. One is, of course, we don't know where the 2 torpedoes that were destroyed were in relation to this other torpedo in the spread. And, of course, we also don't know what happened to the other torpedo, the 4th one. So the track that Hornet's crew report seeing them go past them was seen off of her starboard quarter, and she initiated a hard turn to port. It's also noted that that torpedo came within very close distance of USS North Carolina as well. So if I'm reading all of that correctly, that would suggest that if the 2 torpedoes that were destroyed were to the starboard of the torpedo that Hornet avoided, then in theory the other torpedo that wasn't destroyed would have been even further beyond that, and so by taking the evasive action she did, she would have avoided the entire spread even had that bomb not gone off, because presumably the spread was just slightly ahead, and that portside turn meant she avoided the sort of the rearmost of the spread as relative to Hornet's line of approach. However, it's also possible, because we just do not know, that the 2 torpedoes that were destroyed were to the port of the torpedo that was seen, which would then imply that the other torpedo, the 4th torpedo, could either have been to the starboard of the one that was seen, and therefore obviously passed ahead, or it could have been torpedo number 1 in the spread all the way to port and could have passed completely unseen behind Hornet. So Hornet may have had 2 torpedoes go one either side of her, and the 2 torpedoes that, even with her turn, probably would have hit her were the ones that were destroyed by the Avenger. Unfortunately, it's not really possible to tell precisely because, as I said, Hornet's crew and the Avenger didn't spot all 4 torpedoes that we know were fired, and we don't know from the records where those destroyed torpedoes were in relation to the torpedo that went past Hornet. So reconstructing exactly what happened is not entirely possible, but we are left with something of a binary choice of either Hornet successfully would have evaded the entire spread, or potentially Hornet would have been nailed by the 2 torpedoes the Avenger destroyed. Christopher Villenfort asks, name 3 top minor countries that punched above their weight class from a naval perspective during some time in the Channel's period of coverage. This could either be they had a bigger navy than could be expected, better ships or technology, better training and officers, or some other significant or impressive achievement. Well, the first one is a little bit of a difficult one to maybe say because at one point they were quite a major power, but then gradually diminished into minor status, and that would be Portugal. Because, of course, at one point, they were important enough that when the Pope was dividing up the world between Spain and Portugal, well, 1, he was dividing it between Spain and Portugal, and 2, Portugal got a fair chunk of it. And they didn't manage to hold on to necessarily all of it, but that's kind of beside the point. But when, for example, the Spanish decided, actually, we're going to take over Portugal, which it would not be the first or the last time they attempted that, one of the first things they did was nab the Portuguese fleet, because although Portugal, compared to Spain, was a much smaller country, they had some of the best ships and some of the best crews around, and quite a lot of the Portuguese fleet showed up in the Spanish Armada. And for a country whose star had really fallen a fair way by the classic age of sail of the 18th century, for example, the Portuguese fleet still managed to be a fairly respectable fighting force and a very valuable ally at points during various stages of the Napoleonic and, prior to that, Revolutionary Wars. Another classic example would be the Dutch, because, well, for all the problems that Britain has, being a relatively small island stuck at the northwestern end of Europe, the Dutch are an even smaller country stuck in Europe, which at a good chunk of the medieval and Renaissance periods, and even into the classic Age of Sail period, means you're stuck next to France and within punching distance of Spain. Fortunately, during most of this period, the Italians and Germans are a bunch of city-states and somewhat less capable of causing trouble compared to the Germans in the 20th century, for example. But what this means is that the Dutch actually have less space than even the British to work with, and therefore less resources. And, unlike the British, they have to maintain a relatively decent standing army at the times they're managing to get their independence to make sure they keep that independence from various hostile powers who might come marching across their border at any moment. And on top of all of that, they still manage to put together a very powerful trading empire and an incredibly powerful battle fleet. In fact, pretty much the only single-nation battle fleet that ever really gave the Royal Navy a proper run for its money. Because whilst the French Navy at points came close to threatening the Royal Navy, when they were actually in conflict, the French Navy tended to end up losing in a straight-up prolonged fight with the Royal Navy, and when it scored strategic level successes like forcing the Royal Navy out of the Mediterranean, it's because it was allied with other people like the Spanish, whereas the Dutch managed to beat up on the Royal Navy all on their own. In fact, at one point, the Royal Navy actually ended up allied with the French against the Dutch to try and keep them down. So yeah, they were really punching quite above their weight class given their size and strategic situation in continental Europe. And I think probably I would also go for Sweden, because although at times historically Sweden has been a little bit larger than it is currently, they did basically do a knockdown, drag-out Baltic naval fight with the Russians, where they didn't get immediately steamrolled by the colossally superior resource base and population base of Russia, and they continue to build some of the world's most impressive coastal defense craft through various periods of history, up to and including, they didn't build them during the Second World War, but they had a fleet of coastal defense craft in the Second World War that, as I've mentioned a few other times on the Drydock, were strong enough that although the Kriegsmarine thought they probably could fight their way through the Swedish Navy, they thought they'd take so many casualties in doing so that what was left of the Kriegsmarine would be an easy mop-up operation for anyone else they were fighting, like, I don't know, the Royal Navy. Alec Ruby asks, what is your favourite naval artwork of all time and why? And could you give a brief summary of what is being shown and why? Well, as with a number of other sort of my favourite things, they tend to operate a little bit on a rotation basis, but right at this moment, this, I would say, is my favourite artwork piece. You will have seen it in the Trafalgar video several times, and this is, of course, the piece I commissioned from Gordon Fricker's signature down there at the bottom, as well as him letting me use other artwork he's already done for Trafalgar. But the reason I really, really like this is not just is it the Battle of Trafalgar, victory is breaking the line, and you've got Bucentaur and Redoutable there, the stern of Santissima and Trinidad creeping in there on the right, but this is a collaborative work between us, in as much as an awful lot of research went into the specific timing of what's being shown. You can see there the 68 4-pounder carronade just discharging, so it's the start of Victory's rolling broadside. But what we did was we were trying to depict that exact moment, the moment Victory crosses Bucentaur's stern and opens fire, and that little element, i.e. from the centre of the picture on to the right from the viewer's perspective, that wasn't too difficult because that's very well known. The bit on the left, what's happening with Redoutable, that was an entirely different matter because there are multiple conflicting accounts of exactly what happened there and exactly what the timing was. There is obviously written accounts of what happened from Santissima Trinidad, Bucentaur, Victory, Temeraire, Neptune, Redoutable herself, Fougeot, all in various fragments, and of course some multiple eyewitnesses on some of those ships. And they're all slightly different, which was interesting to try and work out. But fundamentally, we kept coming back to a number of specific points, which was that for all the fact that it is very good as general background and some of the specific details, Captain Lucar's account from Redoutable is a little bit overinflated and self-congratulatory to the point that his version of events, which is unsupported by literally everyone else, is that Redoutable was riding Bucentaur's stern right up close and Victory actually rammed Redoutable out of the way. Whereas it's actually pretty clear from Bucentaur, Victory, Fougeot, Neptune and Temeraire that there was a gap that Victory went through, and Redoutable tried at the last minute to close up that gap. And also that the general consensus being that Redoutable coming up managed to get her bowsprit in amongst Victory's bowsprit at yards and the rigging associated with the foremast. And that actually answered a couple of very important questions when it came to this particular interaction, because if Redoutable had been right on Bucentaur's stern, as Lucar maintained, then when Victory hit her, she would have come to a relative stop, which would have meant Victory would not have been able to deliver the rolling broadside that devastated Bucentaur, that Bucentaur's survivors definitely recorded as occurring. Also, you'd be hard-pressed to explain why Redoutable didn't fire its own raking broadside, at least with its forward guns, into Victory, if that was the case. Conversely, if Victory passed by Bucentaur and then Redoutable rammed into the side of Victory, you have equally difficult explanations to make as to why Victory's gunners didn't do to Redoutable what they'd just done to Bucentaur and hit Redoutable with a rolling broadside raking down from her bow. And so, almost by process of elimination, together with the description of Bucentaure's bow and bowsprit tangling with the Victory's forward rigging, we ended up at the conclusion that what actually happened was Redoutable was trying to close the gap, got tangled up with Victory, so almost made it, but not quite. And then, of course, Victory, having the greater speed and the greater mass, hauls Redoutable around, so they're side by side, basically still facing perpendicular to the bulk of the Franco-Spanish line, and the momentum carries them past Bucentaure, which is what allows Temeraire and Neptune and Leviathan and Conqueror and so on and so forth to all come up past behind. And then it was a case of working out some final details of what exactly does that kind of impact look like. And so if you notice, there's some very subtle differences between the sails of Redoutable and Bucentaure, because Bucentaure is still sailing with what wind she can gather, whereas Redoutable, while she is doing that, you'll notice the sails are just shivering slightly because the ship's just taken a massive jerk to starboard because it's now being hauled around by Victory, and you can see the whole ship is canted over to starboard, i.e. towards the viewer, compared to Bucentaure, because, again, she's being physically hauled around by the mass of the British first rate. So because of the extreme attention to detail, both in terms of artistic depiction and in terms of exactly what's going on in the picture, and the fact that I now own the original, this is currently my favourite piece of naval artwork. Randy Topeka asks, I know your disdain for hybrid battle carriers, but would they have made good support craft for amphibious landings? For example, if you converted an American Standard class into a battle carrier, could you then eliminate the need for escort carriers to be present? Well, firstly, it depends what exactly you mean by hybrid carriers, because you've got hybrid carriers like this thing. I mean, admittedly, this is a cruiser, but the general principle for a hybrid carrier of having a full flight deck, even if a short one, with guns at either end, that's one thing. Conversely, you have something like the Issei conversions, where you just have effectively a launching platform on the back, or like they did to Megami. Now, the latter approach is potentially, in fact, yes, it basically is worse from a carrier operational perspective, because you are restricted to using float planes, and that's assuming you can actually get the things back. Whereas at least with this kind of sort of midships flight deck, you can at least get wheeled aircraft to take off and land, even if somewhat limited ones. Converting standard classes, however, would not be a good idea, because if you are going to do this kind of thing, so you're going to leave some kind of gunnery forward and aft, you work out the distance between the fore and aft guns on a standard, and you actually end up with a flight deck length that's considerably less than the flight deck length of an escort carrier. The only thing you really gain is a little bit of beam, which means you could theoretically store a few more aircraft. But given that you've got less overall length, possibly even not. So you basically would end up with maybe around about an escort carrier's air group, maybe one or two more aircraft, but not that many more. And in exchange for which you've given up at least half of the standard class's firepower, and you have a flight deck that's shorter, and the escort carriers were pretty minimal flight decks already. So I just don't see that really working. Plus, which ones are you going to use? Because if you use Arkansas, Texas, New York, or Pennsylvania, the oldest four, their hulls are even shorter than the New Mexicos, the Tennessees, or the Colorados, which is just going to exacerbate the problem. And if you come after my New Mexicos, I will cut you. Yeah. And then if you do a hybrid carrier conversion of the Colorados, you're still going to have a shorter than escort carrier flight deck, just not quite as bad, and some of your heaviest hitting non-fast battleships have just gone offline. So unfortunately, putting the standard class into battle carriers, yes, in theory they could provide gunfire support for the landings on a limited basis whilst operating a limited amount of aircraft, but they would be so neutered in both respects, it's just not going to be worth it. you need the length of hull to be able to get a decent hangar size and a decent flight group and the runway to operate them. In which case, you might as well go for a cruiser-based hull, because a Cleveland-class cruiser, which was, of course, the basis for the Independence-class light fleet carriers, is as long as a Pennsylvania-class battleship, except that the blast effects from the 6-inch guns are lesser enough that you could probably, maybe if you're being really ambitious, actually have a fairly high-mounted, a Cargi or Kaga-style flight deck that might run the whole length of the ship and have the lower 6-inch turrets firing out the sides. At which point you've got something that would be faster than an escort carrier, which is better than a standard conversion. It's got a longer flight deck than an escort carrier. It's got the ability to do a very limited amount of shore bombardment, and the air group's probably about the same. Now, whilst that might have a very small niche in amphibious landings, it's kind of the inverse of what I've termed the Issei paradox. So, for those of you who've not heard it before, the Issei paradox is that you convert something like Issei to a battle carrier. In theory, you have something that maybe with a few tweaks could provide a modicum of air defense for your fleet, as well as surface defense. But the fact that you're having to resort to that in and of itself is indicative of a much larger problem that the Issei is not going to actually solve. And this is kind of the inverse, in that, yes, you could build a Cleveland or Baltimore class conversion, which retains some heavy anti-surface firepower, whilst having a respectable flight deck and an air group and decent enough speed, at least for what it is. And yes, that would be a somewhat useful all-in-one solution for supporting shore landings. But if you are in a position where you can build such a ridiculous kludge of a ship, and you've got the resources to do that whilst also building your fleet carriers, your battleships, your regular cruisers, etc., you don't need to, because you can afford to build specialist ships to do either the shore bombardment or the offshore air carrier support group roles, because at that point you have that many resources to go. Rande Tupeka asks, are there any examples in history where an entire warship defected to the enemy, Hunt for Red October style? If you mean as in the captain suddenly announces to the crew, hey, we're going over here, and sails the ship into an enemy port and surrenders, that is spectacularly rare. There are far more common, well, relatively speaking, occurrences of ships having a mutiny and the mutineers defecting to the other side. There's at least half a dozen cases I can think off the top of my head where usually frigates, for some bizarre reason, end up having a mutiny and then sailing into an enemy-held port. A number of British frigates had mutinies and sailed into French or Spanish ports. At least one Dutch frigate sailed into a British port, and so on and so forth. There have been a few attempted mutinies by the captain and or senior officers to take ships and sail them to enemy ports, but I'm not off the top of my head aware of any of them succeeding in kind of a whole ship defection. Of course, if other people do know of successful attempts thus, please obviously let me know in the comments below. But as I said, as far as I'm aware, the majority of these kinds of incidents seem to occur in the age of sail, and it's mutineers rising up against the officers and then heading to enemy port, mostly to escape the retaliation that they are fairly certain is coming to them. I mean, technically speaking, you could count stuff like the ships that defected from the Marine Nationale to the Free French, or from various other occupied countries to either the Royal Navy or to the free governments in exile, because technically speaking, a lot of the time there was at least a puppet government, or now a changed authority by conquest, which of course the ships refused to recognise, and particularly in the case of French ships that went over to the Free French, of course, there was technically a continuity government with the Vichy government, which they were directly going against the orders of by joining the Free French forces. Richard Su asks, considering the battleship Mutsu blew up without contributing much to the Japanese war efforts in World War II, would Japan have been better off not pressing for the right to finish Mutsu during the Washington Naval Conference? If so, how would Japan conceding Mutsu at the Washington Naval Conference influence World War II? Well, I mean, hindsight is 2020, so yes, in theory, a ship that didn't do all that much except scatter itself widely across the harbour was probably better off not being built in the first place. However, if the Japanese had not pressed for Mutsu, there's two ways that could go. Either a reduction in overall tonnages, and this is the kind of the problem, is that if the allocated tonnages stay the same, but Japan doesn't have Mutsu, it has a single 16-inch gunship. That is going to mean they're not going to be very happy about a force which theoretically is supposed to be 50% greater than them having 300% as many 16-inch ships, i.e. the Americans finishing the 3 Colorados. And considering the British sort of got Hood grandfathered in kind of as their in one of their ships, you'd be looking at either the Americans having to not complete another Colorado, so maybe only having 2 Colorados, although even then the force balance is a bit difficult to justify, because on a 553 basis, Japan having 2 ships and Britain and America both having 3 ships that are considered modern and cutting edge, that kind of works. So the Americans have 3 Colorados, the British have Hood, Nelson, and Rodney, the Japanese have Nagato and Mutsu. If the Japanese only have Nagato, the British having Hood and the Americans retaining 1 Colorado is obviously not going to sit well with any of them. But the Americans having 2 Colorados to 1 Japanese Nagato, and the British having to come up with a one-off ship to complement Hood, that's actually theoretically, according to the treaty, at least somewhat disproportionate. So possibly what Japan might negotiate is they might say, okay, well, we won't complete Mutsu now. Britain still gets to build Nelson and Rodney. America still gets to complete its 3 Colorados. But much like how France and Italy were granted early build options, they didn't end up taking them up, but they could have had them. Perhaps Japan will negotiate an early replacement option for not Mutsu, because at that point then they'll probably have to keep the 2 Kawachis around for a bit, and then maybe in the late 1920s look at trying to build another one-off ship to fill in the gap taken up by Mutsu. Of course, which of these options gets taken up will influence World War II. I mean, if it's that last solution, it's not going to influence things a whole lot, because the Americans will still have the 3 Colorados, the British will still have Nelson and Rodney and Hood, and not Mutsu, whatever form it's in, will probably have a similar career, although possibly without the self-destructive elements of it. Whereas if, for whatever reason, everything is reduced, so there's only 1 Nelson class and there's only 2 Colorados, well, having 2 Colorados, 3 Colorados probably doesn't massively affect the American war effort all that much. But the British only having 1 35,000-ton battleship freshly built off the stocks plus Hood means that they might still go for Nelson, but a single 16-inch battleship sitting all on its own is going to be difficult, so they may end up going with F3 as a single battle cruiser to complement Hood. Well, that might change things a little bit, because you know my thoughts on F3. Cisco Fan asks, can you explain age of sail positions like Master and Commander and Post Captain? Were they ranks, assignments, or what other similar positions were there? Master and Commander, somewhat rare-ish title, but essentially it derives from the fact that way back, you didn't actually necessarily have to have any real knowledge of the sea or commanding a ship in order to actually captain one, because You might be just a businessman who owns the ship, you ordered it to be built, and is accompanying the ship, and therefore, because you own it, you get to be in charge of it. Or you might be a nobleman who's been put in charge of that ship and maybe a squadron or a fleet because of your rank, not because of any substantive sea experience. So at that point, realizing that people who have no idea how to sail a ship but are technically in charge will probably end up smashing the ship into something rather large and unavoidable, you had a system where you had a ship's master, and this would be a non-commissioned rank, and that was essentially the highest non-commissioned rank available, and that was basically the guy who knew how the ship ran, navigated the ship, the guy who was practically speaking in charge of everything the ship did except for where it was going, because the captain, admiral, whatever would say, I want to go here, but it was the ship's master who would actually see that it was done. A commander is obviously a rank in the Royal Navy, and for somebody to be master and commander, it reflects both the fact that it's a small ship and maybe can't afford to have an experienced ship's master on as well as a commander to lead the ship, but also the fact that in the 18th century Royal Navy, because it's getting more professionalized, because you've got the lieutenant's exam, etc., whilst you might still have a ship's master for day-to-day running of the ship on larger vessels, a senior officer, such as a commander, would be expected to know enough about the ship in order to be able to handle it. So a particularly good up-and-coming officer might become master and commander of the ship, i.e. their officer's rank is substantive enough that they are, as a courtesy, the captain of the ship, but they also are the one with all the knowledge of navigation, etc., to get the ship going. A post captain, on the other hand, is just a specific point within a captain's career. So you might be promoted to captain as the result of actions on a particular vessel's commission, because remember, at this point, vessels would commission, they would undertake a mission or a set of voyages or whatever, but when they came back to dock to pay off and decommission to be refitted, everybody went ashore, essentially. So the crew would be paid off, they could then join up with another ship if they wanted to. The officers would go off on half pay and could be assigned to other ships, or potentially the same ship when it came back out again. But whatever, you might come back off of such a mission and be told, well, congratulations, you annoyed insert country that we're annoyed with here. So we're going to promote you to captain, but you're a captain on half pay. You've never actually been in charge of a rated ship, i.e. a 6th rate or above, which are the ships that were held to be the ones that needed a full captain to be in charge of. But as and when you were assigned to a ship for the first time as its captain, both in general title and in specific rank, you were posted to that ship, so you became a post captain, i.e. a post captain is a captain who is on his first commission as the captain of a rated vessel, whether that be a 6th rate, 5th rate, all the way up to a 1st rate. Although you won't find very many people being posted as post captains onto a 1st rate, it's usually a frigate. Andrew Dederer asks, how enforceable were neutrality laws in the 19th century? I'm thinking of the contrast between the cases of CSS Florida, which was disabled by a possibly dubious accident while sheltering in Brazil, and CSS Alabama in Cherbourg, in which case it seems that arrangements were made beforehand so none of Alabama's officers would face imprisonment. Was having some large ship to intimidate visitors into good behaviour as well as neighbours a major factor driving South American naval expansion? Well, to be honest, as with neutrality laws in the 20th century and even such laws and similar ones in the 21st century, it's a case of, can you enforce them yourself at the point of a gun if necessary? And that's not just in terms of, can you physically do so? Because back in the 19th century, a lot of ports would have fortifications, And prior to ironclads, or even after ironclads, if the ship in question it was not itself an ironclad, if a ship is sitting stationary in a neutral port and they violate the laws of neutrality, and that port's fortifications turn its guns on them as a stationary target, it's probably not long for this world, especially since forts tend to have rather active heated shot furnaces and so forth. But that's just the physical can you do it. There's also the are you in a position to do it? So if you are neutral in a conflict and a ship shows up and decides to flaunt the neutrality in any way, shape or form, if your nation is ostensibly neutral but does happen to conduct, let's say, 80% of its trade with the country that owns the ship in question, you can make a lot of diplomatic protests, but your government may not be quite so keen on actually doing anything active to kick the ship out, because that may annoy the person who controls your economic lifeline. So there's that aspect. Can you, as the individual country, actually enforce your own neutrality laws? And in the 19th century, specifically, the other thing for the majority of it was, is Britain interested? Because if Britain is interested, and you in and of yourself are not capable of enforcing the neutrality laws for whatever reason, you could always slip a word to the local British ambassador or attaché, and then a very big Royal Navy warship might show up and go, "Oi, you're the one violating the neutrality laws. You're going to obey them, or else." But, of course, that means you've got to find a conflict that Britain is actually interested enough in coming over to enforce rules about, which varied depending on which laws, doctrines, etc. were in play for which people. I mean, it's often said that the greatest enforcers of the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century were the British, mainly because they thought it was a good idea to keep all the other European powers out of the area that America didn't want them in. And the British didn't have a huge amount of interest in expanding their interest in that area either. If the Royal Navy or the British Empire generally had decided, actually, we don't like this Monroe Doctrine and we're going to go in and do stuff, or it serves our interest to let Europe go and fight over in the American hemisphere, for most of the 19th century, there's precious little the US could have actually done to enforce it. And obviously, if you have a big navy and you can afford to enforce it, then you can do your own enforcement very easily, such as with Cherbourg, where you had the rather amusing thing of Kearsarge and Alabama fighting it out after Alabama had been very carefully escorted to outside the limit of French territorial waters by the Couronne, a socking great French ironclad which could have beaten both Kearsarge and Alabama into splinters with barely even a raised breath. And hung around watching the fight just to make sure that neither of them strayed back into French territorial waters either. Little Dweller asks, you spoke in an earlier video about Graf Zeppelin potentially being used as a commerce raider. If carriers and their aircraft had been developed sooner, or at least built in larger quantities, do you think they would have had a practical use as commerce raiders or commerce protectors instead of cruisers? Supposing that light carrier-sized ships would be used for such a role, although perhaps with a bit more speed, and how would they compare with cruisers for cost-effectiveness? Unfortunately, I don't think they would have been very useful in that role, partly because, frankly, the striking power of aircraft significantly prior to World War II against moving ship targets, and I stress moving targets, was pretty darn awful. So a bunch of carriers running around maybe could hurt a couple of merchant ships, but honestly, a cruiser of the same size could do a lot more damage. And, you know, they're limited in range, they're limited in payload, they're very fragile, etc., etc., etc. One of the other reasons is that a light carrier-sized vessel is not going to possess any substantial amount of armor, it's not going to possess any substantial amount of weaponry to defend itself in a surface action, and it's going to have a relatively anemic air complement. One of the reasons why Graf Zeppelin theoretically might have made a halfway decent commerce raider is because of her combination of speed and she can put up an air group large enough to actually menace a convoy, and she's got the surface gun power and protection to be able to deal with your typical convoy escorts, at least until the fact that she's out there commerce raiding forces everybody to, soup up their convoy escorts to include heavy cruisers and old battleships again. Light carriers can't do that. So that, they would just lose gunfights to regular cruisers that can be made to go even faster than them, or even similar speed, which would be a rather major problem. So yeah, unfortunately, the aircraft carrier in and of itself, in the interwar period for the majority of it, it just isn't developed enough to really do commerce raiding or protection, because, even as the various fleet exercises showed, without radar and without quote-unquote modern, i.e. late 30s, early 40s aircraft, it was basically impossible to stop a really determined cruiser or even capital ship from getting in close enough to massacre you if they really put their mind to it. There were, of course, cruiser-sized battle carriers, which were considered, for the US Navy at least, but even those, trying to combine the protection of a cruiser with some of its firepower but the long-range capabilities of an aircraft carrier, even those didn't come to much for various reasons, including the vulnerability of the hangar. Jonathan Smith asks, were any of the various navies' armoured cruisers refitted with centralised direct-to-fire control prior to the end of World War I? Yes, although only just. So armoured cruisers weren't actually, believe it or not, particularly high on the list of ships to be fitted with direct controls and central firing computers and so forth. Light cruisers like the Town class for the British, for example, actually had priority over them, as did fitting direct control to the secondary batteries of capital ships. However, some of the surviving larger armoured cruisers, like HMS Cochrane of the Warrior class, the two surviving Minotaurs, so Minotaur and Shannon, were given direct-to-fire control in mid to late 1917, going through into early 1918, during various refits. So they did get it, but essentially in the last year or so of the war. The Germans, as far as I can tell, didn't bother, because frankly they didn't have pretty much any of their modern armoured cruisers left at that point. The only armoured cruiser they had by the middle of World War I that had been laid down this side of the 20th century was Rune, and she was 2-3 generations behind the latest in terms of armoured cruiser design. The Wind Thief asks, I was reading through the NavWeb's website and I noticed that most 6-inch guns designed in the 20s and 30s had similar fire rates of around 5 rounds a minute, maybe a little bit more for the British. However, the stated fire rate for the German 5.9-inch SKC-25 gun used on Nuremberg was 10 to 12 rounds per minute, and the American 6-inch 47 Mark 16 was 8 to 10 rounds per minute, with some sources indicating possibly even more. So my question is, why the large difference in fire rate for guns designed only a few years apart? How much does the fire rate of a breech-loading gun depend on the design of the weapon itself, and how much does it depend on other factors such as mounting, hoists, crew training, etc.? So I think there's two distinctions to be made here. Well, maybe a third one as well. One is a lot of it depends on how quickly ammunition can be supplied to the guns. So do you have a hoist supplying directly to each gun? Do you have maybe 2 hoists supplying 3 guns? Do you have the hoist supplying a handling room below the gun house, which then has to be handed up? All of this is going to affect how much ammunition is reaching your guns per minute. So that's going to be an initial restriction or expansion on your ability to fire. And then you also have the loading mechanism, how much of it is power assisted, how much is manual. But you then also have to take into account of what exactly are you dealing with? Because as you can see here from this picture of USS Brooklyn, the US guns used what's called semi-fixed ammunition. So you had the shell and you had the propellant as 2 separate units, but the propellant was in a brass cartridge. So it was relatively quick and easy to handle, and obviously somewhat more precise. You slam the shell in, slam the cartridge in, everything gets rammed home, gun gets closed up, bang, goes the gun, out pops the cartridge, recycle, go again. Whereas a lot of guns from this time period were using bagged charges, kind of like the big battleship guns, and those are just a little bit more finicky to deal with compared to a brass cartridge. They do have an advantage of being slightly lighter to handle, but overall, semi-fixed ammunition is usually somewhat easier to hand load than completely separate ammunition. That explains part of it. The hoists explain another part of it. Size of the turret, training of the crews explain another part of it. Some gun turrets, for example, the at Belfast and Edinburgh, had better ammunition supply systems than some of the early British 6.6-inch turrets, which meant they could maintain a higher rate of fire, more closely approaching the American rate of fire than not, but they still have bagged cordite rather than semi-fixed ammunition. And with the German ones, I tend to take most figures like that for the German ships with a pinch of salt, and that's not because I have anything particularly against German vessels. There are some aspects of German vessels where their high performance is entirely earned, like, say, Prinz Eugen's hydrophones, but they do have form when it comes to things like rate of fire, of conducting their rate of fire assessments in absolutely optimal conditions, and then those figures getting reported through and stuck to, even if they don't actually manage to pull that kind of thing off in combat. Like, for example, Bismarck's rate of fire. The Bismarck fanboys will insist to you that Bismarck is the superior ship because its 15-inch guns can fire once every 20 seconds, despite the fact that at no point in its entire career in active combat did Bismarck ever fire anything even close to that quickly. For pretty much the same reason as most other battleships theoretically having a rate of fire about 1 round every 30 seconds, almost never fired at a rate of 1 round every 30 seconds. Although, interestingly enough, at the Battle of Jutland, Iron Duke was getting rounds down range at 20 to 23 seconds between salvos at one point. You don't see that many Bismarck fanboys going on about the superior Iron Duke class loading systems 20 years earlier, do you? Anyway, I suspect that much like the Bismarck systems, the Nürnbergs theoretically could do that, and maybe in an exercise with a well-rested, well-trained crew, they might actually pull off something like that. But more realistically, various bits of machinery are going to break down. The crew are not going to be operating on an absolute perfect tempo, and their rate of fire is going to come down a bit, but probably still be in the upper echelons of things for roughly 6-inch caliber gunfire rates. John Rees asks, have there ever been any speciality-novelty shells made for naval guns as a joke or for data gathering? I've been going down a rabbit hole on various 2.2 rounds and wondering if a similar concept has been tried for naval purposes. I'm not so sure about speciality or novel shells. They're pretty big and expensive things to make as a joke, but there have been some slightly unusual shells. Obviously, the Japanese Type 3 anti-aircraft 18.1-inch, and 14-inch shells, battleship-grade anti-aircraft shells. They're quite specialist, I guess. You've got the French building their initial batch of 15-inch shells with pockets for poison gas. That's a pretty niche use, contributed to a lot of their early gun problems, to be honest. But so that's neither here nor there. There was also, I think, was it Project Harp or something, a little past the channel's time, where someone basically stuck a pair of 16-inch gun barrels together, tried to make like a 100 caliber 16-inch gun and fire shells, i.e. small satellites, into space. I mean, a 16-inch satellite fired into space by a 100 caliber gun would probably be a pretty unique novelty item, I would estimate. And then, of course, you've got specialist inert training shells, which we used on firing ranges or at sea. And very occasionally, you might get a tracer shell, and as in not just a shell that had an amount of tracer. Quite a number of battleship shells did at various points, but a shell that was specifically designed to have quite a significant amount of tracer burn on it to help chart the course of a shell through the sky for specific land-based experiments to calculate things like ballistic tables and monitor shell performance before things were released for sea service. Christopher Villenfort asks, as I understand it, the Type 1936 destroyers all had problems with being top-heavy, especially the one with 150mm guns, more so than the others. Would it have been better to replace the aft two singles with a double, thereby moving some of the weight further down? As I understand, the twin turret weighed about twice what the singles, so there's no total net weight gain or loss. And do you believe the 1936C version with 328mm flak 40-2s would have been a better option for the destroyers? I mean, yes, in theory, replacing the aft two single guns with a twin mount on the lower position would help a little bit with stability, although then you'd have greater weight concentrated further aft, so, swings and roundabouts on that one, I think. It would have made a marginal contribution. It wouldn't have solved the overall problems that those ships had. There's a lot wrong with that, with using guns that large, even on a destroyer hull as big as the Germans made them. The 1936C version with the 128mm dual-purpose guns, that would have been a much, much better option. I mean, it's not like the Germans didn't have a 128mm gun which they could put on destroyers. Quite a number of destroyer classes in the interwar period, including the Type 1936Bs, had 127mm or 128mm guns. The only problem was they were all low-angle weapons. So turning around and going, actually, you know what, we're going to make a dual-purpose version out of this, or, adopt the land-based version into a dual-purpose version. Just anything with a 127-128mm caliber weapons in the late 30s to create a dual, or even the mid-30s to create a proper dual-purpose weapon would have been an infinitely superior choice, because, well, you would have gotten much better anti-aircraft defense capability out of it, and for all the various reasons that make a good anti-aircraft gun, high rate of fire, etc., etc., would have done them a world of good compared to having big, overweight 5.9-inch mounts. Greg M. asks, in a video with Dr. Clark, you and he spoke very highly of the British 4.5-inch gun of World War II. How does that gun compare to the US Navy's 5-inch 38 from the same war, about which you did a very good video? Thank you very much. So a little ways back, I did a video comparing the anti-aircraft guns of World War II, at least the naval ones. And in terms of the Allied heavy anti-aircraft guns, well, overall the US 5-inch 38 came out on top, period. And in terms of the Allied anti-aircraft guns, the UK 4.5-inch 45 was just behind it. Not a huge amount of difference, really. The 5-inch 38 had a average rate of fire that was a fraction higher than the 4.5-inch, but the 4.5-inch still had a pretty decent rate of fire. Interestingly enough, despite being half an inch larger, the 5-inch shell for the US 5-inch 38 and the 4.5-inch shell for the UK gun are actually exactly the same weight. They're 25 pounds. But it means because of the higher rate of fire, the 5-inch 38 gets slightly more weight of metal into the air per minute. However, despite having a slightly lower muzzle velocity, the 4.5-inch actually has a slightly greater overall range than the 5.5-inch 38, because it's the same weight of shell, but obviously in a considerably, well, not considerably, a somewhat smaller package, therefore presents a slightly denser and lower surface area projectile, so it's going to retain velocity slightly further out. And I mean, to be fair, it's a little bit marginal. It's about 600 yards additional range. We're not talking massive amounts here, but it's still a technical win. Obviously, the outright winner in that category is the 5.25, but it has other issues, most especially its rate of fire, to be perfectly honest. So yeah, the 4.5 inch is pretty competitive with the 5-inch 38, all things considered. And especially once, obviously, post-war auto-loading comes in, it is actually somewhat interesting. Because although during the Second World War, the 5-inch 38 was, definitely a slightly better anti-aircraft weapon, the British developed the 4.5-inch 45 further, which meant that a subsequent variant came out towards the end of the war, and that variant lasted through into the 1960s in frontline service, whereas whilst the 5-inch 38 also persisted in frontline service throughout the Cold War, much as the 4.5 actually did, the 4.5 45 remained a frontline install until the 60s, whereas the 5-inch 38 was very rapidly supplanted by the 5-inch 54 in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Of course, the Royal Navy still has 4.5-inch deck guns in service, and the US still has 5-inch deck guns in service, but both of those weapons really only share a caliber with their World War II equivalents. October Nid asks, in a number of videos the phrase mentioned in dispatches comes up in regards to exceptional actions. It seems self-explanatory, but could you elaborate on it? Is it just what it sounds like in services other than the Royal Navy, and is it still in use today? So this goes back quite a long way because, believe it or not, up until somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, there wasn't actually any medal for gallantry for the rank and file. There was scarcely anything organised even for officers, but they could be voted specific medals and rewards by various people. And then that all changed in the 19th century, and then gradually more and more medals at various levels were introduced until you get to the 20th century. So way back, prior to about 1850-ish, 1850-something, if you were regular rank and file, the only real way for you to get recognised if you did something exceptional was for it to be written down and then published as part of the reports. And even for officers as well, sometimes, if you're a midshipman or a lieutenant, the only way that you might get recognised for your heroic actions would be if the captain's report mentioned you. Now, of course, back in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, the only way to get the information about what had happened back to somebody in London would be via a dispatch boat, via sending dispatches. And so mentioned in dispatches essentially means that when your superior officer, captain, admiral in the Navy, or equivalent ranks in the Army, wrote up their report and said, this is what's happened, just FYI, they would mention your name. So they'd say, Able Seaman Smith was exceptionally heroic in his defence of the ship against a French boarding action. So that would be your mention in dispatches. So it was a noted down indication that you were a brave and good man. And that could have various effects depending on the degree of your heroism and how that was received at home. You might be awarded something, your career might progress a little bit better, and various things like that. Once medals were introduced, mentioned in dispatches essentially becomes the lowest rank of recognised award, because obviously if you do something really heroic, you get the Victoria Cross. That's usually posthumous. If you do something fairly heroic, but not quite Victoria Cross level, there's a whole range of different medals that you can receive nowadays. And if, when someone's writing up a report of what happened, they go, yeah, actually, no, that guy was properly brave, then you get mentioned in dispatches. Being mentioned in dispatches might then lead to you getting a medal, but not necessarily. And after World War I, if you were mentioned in dispatches, then if you can see here on these two miniature medals, the one on the right has this snazzy little oak leaf cluster on it, and that is what you can display on your campaign medal if you were mentioned in dispatches during that particular campaign. Paul from Chicago asks, I was looking at the Devonshire class armoured cruiser. It seems much more powerful and better designed than the preceding Monmouth, with a better gun arrangement at freeboard and seakeeping. Why didn't Craddock get one of these? If he had had one of these rather than Monmouth or Good Hope, is Coronel a different engagement? Well, the reason that Craddock didn't get a Devonshire for his formation was essentially because, apart from Glasgow, most of Craddock's formation was essentially a scratch force. So Otranto obviously was an armed merchant cruiser. Both Good Hope and Monmouth had been in the Fleet Reserve prior to being called up with the rising hostilities and then the outbreak of war in 1914, and there was significant amounts of naval reservists aboard, as is fairly well known. The Devonshires, with the exception of Devonshire herself, had, however, seen continuous service. Devonshire had spent a brief period in reserve, but she'd been reactivated in 1913 and by 1914 was fully worked up with a full-time naval crew. So come the outbreak of war, the Devonshires had all been assigned to the Grand Fleet, and so when they were thinking, well, right, we should probably send a cruiser force over to South America, they couldn't take cruisers away from the Grand Fleet, but they could give Craddock a bunch of ships that had been just reactivated, i.e. Monmouth and Good Hope, plus ships that had just been converted, i.e. Otranto. Glasgow was already down in South America doing regular patrol work, which is why a relatively new town class was present as well. So, yeah, that's basically why it doesn't get a Devonshire. And you've also got to remember that there were various moves during the build-up to Coronel to actually send Craddock HMS Defence, and he had got HMS Canopus. Obviously, there were issues with Canopus and her chief engineer, and Defence got diverted. But in theory, if Canopus had actually been fully functional and stayed with him, that may well have changed things. Von Spee certainly seems to have thought so. And if Canopus and Defence were both with Craddock, then it would have made a huge difference, far more than any Devonshire would. However, if, let's say, one of the Devonshires was assigned instead of, let's say, Monmouth, because Good Hope is, at least on paper, a more powerful vessel than Monmouth, then it might make a small difference, but mostly on the basis of the fact, not so much in terms of performance, because, say, Good Hope has bigger guns, and both on paper, Good Hope and Monmouth are not faster, but the main thing is that whatever Devonshire-class cruiser would be assigned to Craddock would be a full professional naval crew, so therefore their performance in battle might be a little bit higher. But even then, the main thing is going to be, does Craddock try and keep Otranto with them? Because Otranto was kind of the ball and chain around the leg of being able to engage when they wanted to, because Monmouth and Good Hope, if their engines are at full functionality, and Glasgow is even faster than them, could match Scharnhorst and Gneisenau for speed, which would mean that with the coast behind them, they could force Von Spee into an engagement if Craddock really wanted to, but with Otranto present, he couldn't. So perhaps it would have been better if Otranto had been replaced by one of the Devonshires, because that would give Craddock a squadron that could actually force action with a coastline behind Von Spee, along with obviously the additional firepower, which might have made a difference. Fireteam Joker asks, the commander of HMS Glowworm was awarded a VC for his action against the Admiral Hipper, but what makes this special is that he was awarded it partially due to the recommendation by the enemy captain. The book I read said this only happened twice in World War II. My questions are, 1, how often are captains given a VC for getting their ship cut in half ramming a battleship? And 2, what was the other time? Well, before anyone kicks off in the comments and trying to correct it all, obviously Admiral Hipper is a heavy cruiser, contrary to what Dark Seas would have you believe. But in the grand scheme of things, Glowworm's one-man engagement against Hipper isn't really any less brave considering the balance of power involved. But to answer your main question, captains, the situation in the Royal Navy is such, at least during World War I and World War II, that a destroyer coming up against a large enemy cruiser alone is a, fortunately, relatively rare occurrence. But given the circumstances where Glowworm pretty much did everything according to the Royal Navy playbook, she encountered German destroyers, multiple, she engaged them and forced them to run away. Then a much bigger enemy showed up. Glowworm initially did the sensible thing and laid a smokescreen whilst trying to disengage, but when it became clear that that wasn't going to work, she decided to attack, despite having already been damaged. She executed an attack through no fault of her own. That didn't work because Hippo was smart and managed to avoid being hit by Glowworm's first torpedo spread. And then Glowworm, realizing, of course, that this is a no-win scenario, decided, well, at least we should try and take Hippo with us, and again acted within the proper traditions of the Royal Navy, first withdrawing back into smoke to try and get her second torpedo launcher working, and when that failed because Hippo came through the smoke, intent on finishing her off, Glowworm decided, well, the only thing we have left as a weapon is our ship itself, and used it as such. So those kind of situations are pretty rare. But in similar situations, if a captain executes his duty to the absolute utmost of his ability, as the captain of Glowworm did, then yeah, they're going to get a VC for it. In terms of the other time that a VC was awarded purely on the basis of enemy reports, that's actually also naval related. That particular award was to Flying Officer Trigg of the Royal New Zealand Air Force, piloting a Liberator, and he found and engaged a U-boat that was caught on the surface. He made his approach run, but on his approach run, the U-boat's flat cannon got the range and started blasting the Liberator apart, at which point one can imagine that Trigg probably concluded that the damage to the Liberator was completely fatal. So breaking off his attack run at that point would only accomplish the fact that his aircraft would crash and they'd all die slightly to the left or right of where they were going to probably crash anyway. And so he just kept on at the U-boat, and we know that he wasn't killed because whilst he kept his attack run going, he opened his bomb bay doors and dropped a salvo of bombs right on top of the U-boat, which did fatal damage and caused the U-boat to sink in fairly short order. Of course, the utterly wrecked Liberator went down pretty much immediately thereafter, but some of the U-boat's crew survived the sinking, and on the basis of the report of the U-boat's captain, Flying Officer Trigg was awarded a posthumous VC. Roadrunner Meep Meep asks, what, in your opinion, is the most ridiculous-unrealistic feat of shipbuilding in the fictional universe? My vote goes to either the development and building of the BC-303 and BC-304 classes in Stargate, or the building of the Iron Fleet without any trees in Game of Thrones. Well, I mean, I've got to say the development of the Daedalus class battle cruisers in Stargate probably ranks up there because, you know, with the initial premise of Stargate SG-1, which essentially is, can the US hide the budget for a handful of teams of light infantry with associated command and control infrastructure within various black budgets? Yeah, sure, that is entirely plausible. Can the US successfully hide the construction of half a dozen, massive future tech, faster than light battle cruisers? That I'm struggling to process a little bit. So yeah, good choice. However, one of my personal bugbears is this monstrous thing, which you can see on screen. So this is supposedly the Supremacy from the, whatever it was, 8th Star Wars film. Tragically, everybody involved in Star Wars died after Episode 7, so I don't know quite why this is showing up on my screen. But nevertheless, apart from the fact it's, yes, well done, you put a B-2 bomber in space, clap, clap, how very original. The thing is utterly stupid. The First Order is supposed to be some, remnant of the Empire hiding away in the unknown regions, quietly rebuilding its strength, and this thing is as wide as just over three Executor-class Superstar Destroyers are long. So, yeah, if you got Darth Vader's flagship from Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, you could get 3 of them nose to tail going across the wingspan of this thing, and you'd still come up about 3 kilometers short. So you'd have to stick another one of these other new Star Destroyer things on the end of them. So, bearing that in mind, and calculating for the overall mass of this thing alone probably masses about as much as the Empire's total Executor-class Star Dreadnought construction output. And that's when the Empire controlled most of the galaxy, or at least most of the known galaxy, and supposedly the First Order put this together, Tony Stark style, with a bunch of scraps in a cave. Yeah, give me a break. It's, apart from, as I said, the design is thoroughly uninspired and a bit ridiculous anyway. It's a thoroughly implausible and dumb thing to come up with for a supposed, resurgent group that's trying to re-establish the Empire, not actually is the Empire. Plus, of course, its turbo lasers mysteriously have ballistic arcs whilst in space, because, of course, that's the thing as well. But the less said about The Last Jedi, the better, otherwise I'm going to start ranting. Coneled asks, if Mikawa had continued to attack the transports after blowing through the cruiser screen at Savo, how much would it have honestly set back US operations on Guadalcanal? Also, were any of his ships likely to survive the retaliatory strikes if he took that time? Honestly, it was probably the Japanese Army and Navy's best chance to retain Guadalcanal, because you've got to remember that although the Allies had landed a ton of troops, most of their supplies were the things that were being unloaded at this point, and, well, there's no built-up supply caches that they can fall back on Guadalcanal, because this is the initial landings and the initial build-up of supplies. And it's also the point when, obviously, the Japanese are the freshest. I mean, yes, they can bring in more troops, they can bring in supplies, etc., but they haven't been on starvation rations for a long time like they would be towards the end of the Guadalcanal campaign. So if Mikawa had pressed forward and destroyed the transports and their supplies and shot up the beachhead a little bit, then the US Marines would have faced a fairly difficult choice, because it would take a while to organise another supply convoy and load it up and get it there. And not just in terms of finding new supply ships and finding supplies to go in them, but you'd also have to organise a big, powerful escort, because, of course, the majority of the escort forces you already have just been sunk. HMAS Australia would probably put up a valiant fight, but as good as she is, she's not going to stand against Mikawa's entire force. So you've lost, basically, at this point, almost the entirety of your surface escort forces, and as a result of that, whatever surface escort forces you put in an attempt to resupply are going to have to be significantly stronger to avoid exactly the same thing happening again. And during all this time, the thousands upon thousands of men you've landed on Guadalcanal are going to be facing attacks from the Japanese, except they have very little in the way of ammunition, food, and other supplies with which to actually hold out against the Japanese, which means that by the time you've built up your new convoy with an even bigger, heavier escort to replace all the other escort you lost, and you're bringing it all in, there's a real chance that the Japanese, at the very least, have retaken Henderson Field, which presents problems in and of itself for the US efforts, and may even have the US forces on the run. It's not because they lack fighting spirit, it's simply because they might have run out of ammunition. And of course, Mikawa was worried about counterattack from US airstrikes, but what he didn't know was that the US carriers had withdrawn to refuel. So there was actually a fairly high chance of Mikawa's force mostly surviving the return journey, because it would be difficult to organise airstrikes from the carriers in time before Mikawa has fully withdrawn. So yeah, if there was ever a butterfly that could have completely upended the results of the Guadalcanal campaign, it was that decision by Mikawa to go back. Unless, of course, you have something like Crutchley's last stand aboard HMS Australia, assuming it's warned, primed, ready to go, and maybe also the third group comes in clutch from the flank at the same time, and somehow pulls, between them, they pull off a surprise to the surprise and manage to deal enough damage to Mikawa's force that it turns him back anyway. You could I suppose you could write that kind of heroic epic if you wanted to, but it's a little bit of an edge case to assume that's going to happen. Mason I asks, if the war in the Pacific had gone on much longer than the war in Europe, would the US have actually pressed Prinz Eugen into service, or just scrapped it? And if it had served, do you think it would have been retrofitted to use more standard equipment, or just have the crew trained to use the Kriegsmarine gear? if the Pacific War had gone on, so let's say the atomic bombs hadn't been invented or didn't work, there is no way, plausibly, that Prinz Eugen is coming into service with the US Navy. She would have been scrapped. I mean, the US Navy was already looking at some of its older ships, like the Omahas, etc., already being deactivated. At the time of the Japanese historic signal that they were going to surrender, the US already has another 7 Oregon City class, which is Baltimore subclass cruisers, under construction, not counting the entire Baltimore class and the first 3 Oregon cities, which are already either in commission or in various stages of fitting out. Plus, of course, they've just laid down a few of the Des Moines class, and they've got a lot of them on order. They've got theoretically 12 ordered, even though they only finished 3 of them. But the other 9 probably would have been constructed, or at least been under construction, as the war had gone on. The US is not hurting for heavy cruisers, and one slightly oversized, inefficient heavy cruiser with completely different technical specs is not what the US Navy is going to want at that point. I mean, a Baltimore or an Oregon City is just flat out superior to Prinz Eugen, and it's also several thousand tons less, and it has equipment commonality with the rest of the US Navy. If for some utterly insane reason the US had decided we're going to bring Prinz Eugen into service with the fleet, you absolutely would have had to refit it. Because, most of the machinery plant broke down because the US was not familiar with how it operated. So you'd be talking about a complete and utter overhaul. It would be purely a prestige thing only, kind of a rubbing it in the Japanese face that we've taken a ship of one of their allies and sailing it up and down their coast. But it would be a massively expensive boondoggle, which would have had to have been like the pet project of President Truman or something, which I highly doubt he would have gone for. They would not have subjected US Navy crew to learning how to operate all the Kriegsmarine gear just for that. Now, having said all that, assuming there's no atomic bombing going on, there is one potential use that I could imagine the US putting Prinz Eugen to in relation to, fighting against Japan. And that would be if there was some really, really critical target that the US really wanted to destroy, for whatever reason hadn't been able to destroy with conventional airstrikes, and they decided to take a leaf out of the Royal Navy's book and reenact the Saint-Nazaire raid on a much, much larger scale, and decided to effectively turn Prinz Eugen into a 17,000 ton version of HMS Campbelltown, and I don't know, flatten half of a Japanese major dockyard, something like that. Just fill the lower part of the ships below the waterline with explosives and turn it into, okay, the atomic bombs don't work. Guess what? We've got kiloton level explosives anyway. I mean, that's always been one thing, to be honest, with the Saint-Nazaire raid, as fantastic as it otherwise was personally, if you're going to go with it, a 4-ton warhead on a full-size destroyer is a little bit unambitious. I would have gone for at least double digits. Admiralty of Floof asks, we all know the somewhat hilarious silencer that the Germans built more recently for their 6-inch howitzers. Say you wanted to lob a 15-inch shell at somebody in World War II or maybe World War I without them realising what it was and where it was from, maybe like Resolution during the air raid and attacking Cherbourg. How silent could such a thing realistically be? Could you have a flash hider, subsonic shells, etc., etc.? And is there any point? Well, it always bears pointing out just how ridiculously silly and large these things actually are. And bear in mind, as has been pointed out by many other channels, silencers don't actually make you movie silent for the most part, unless you're using a well rod. They just reduce the noise from ear splitting to can use without earplugs kind of levels. And the same thing with this, you're still going to hear the artillery gun going off. You're just not necessarily going to immediately think, that is an artillery piece that has just deafened me from 50 yards away, because it'll be a little bit quieter. So, in that respect, what could you realistically do? Subsonic shells, yes, in theory, you could do that. But to be perfectly honest, the supersonic speed of the shells in some ways actually makes them more stealthy because they arrive before you hear them coming. And a 15-inch shell is supersonic even at, 30,000 plus yards. Whereas a subsonic shell, you'll still hear it coming through the air, and the ship will have to get significantly closer, which increases the chances of spotting it. However, you could theoretically do a mostly silent battleship bombardment, apart from, the massive explosions when the shells hit. You're not going to put a silencer or any kind of flash hider on a 15-inch gun. It's just going to be impractically, implausibly silly. But what you could do is use flashless powder, or more accurately, reduced flash powder, the same way that smokeless powder is not in fact smokeless on a battleship scale, it's just slightly less smoke. And in actual fact, instead of subsonic shells, you'd want to go the opposite direction, I think. If you either used a ship, and let's say you said 15-inch guns, so we're going to assume we're using an R-class or a QE. If you either modify the ship's guns or you get one of the modernized ships with a 30-degree elevation, and you get it to use superchargers, so you're going to have to modify the guns anyway, to be perfectly honest, the same way that Vanguard was modified to be able to, in theory, use superchargers at 30 degrees elevation. So what you're aiming for is just to get the absolute maximum possible range out of your guns. Who knows, maybe even use some kind of Savo-like shell, where you're delivering, an 8-inch shell wrapped in a 15-inch Savo, which might extend your range even further. Now, all of this is getting a little bit silly for World War II, but edge case scenario, you might be able to do it. The essential goal is to get your ship over the horizon for most reasonable observation. So you can't actually see the target, but what you would have to do is very precisely chart where you're going to be, probably use subs to put out marker buoys at very specifically calculated locations, and we're talking about like 35, 40,000 yards distance. And then, having done that, you can then work out, okay, well, from this exact position at sea to this exact position where we're targeting, this is the precise fire control solution we're going to require, and you can even pre-calculate that if you want, at which point, with your reduced flash, reduced smoke powder, so they're not necessarily even going to see, a big flash lighting up the horizon, you then get a distraction like a big air raid, at which point you can be sitting there and fire your salvos away, obviously using aerial spotting to correct your fall of shot, and probably a huge amount of preparation to absolutely lock in your fire control solution for the local weather, etc. And in that way, in theory, you could actually be bombarding your enemy without them ever knowing what the heck was happening, except for the fact that random points things start exploding. John Plate asks, in a previous dry dock about Hood with 4 triple 15-inch guns, you said that the speed would drop to between 27 and 28 knots. That means the Royal Navy has only 2 capital ships that can go over 30. Would Hood thus be more likely to get a refit? Honestly, I'm not sure. If they had gone with the 4 triple turret Hood option that they were looking at during this design history, I mean, the reason that Hood was put out there and spent so much time as flagship was because she was held to be big and scary and fast and powerful. In this case, she's going to be even bigger, even scarier, even more powerful. The only thing is she's going to be slightly less fast, but still she's going to be faster than any capital ship in the US fleet and anything in the Japanese fleet that isn't a Congo, and until the Congo refits, potentially even faster than them. So her position as a prestige ship might actually be even greater. However, there is one way in which she might be potentially more likely to get a refit, which is that if she is capable of around about 28 knots, let's say, then when they're putting together the planning for the King George V's they might look at the Royal Navy fleet and go, right, well, we've got Renown and Repulse, relatively lightly protected, very fast battle cruisers, great, fantastic. We've got Hood, which theoretically still has decent protection, has a lot of firepower, in fact has even more firepower, 3 more guns worth of firepower than one of the original Flavor 15-inch on King George V designs, and she is battle speed compatible with the King George V's. At which point they might turn around at the point that they're starting the construction of the King George V, so we're talking, the early part of the second half of the 1930s, and say, well, Hood, therefore, is probably going to be part of our modern fast capital ship battle line for a while, at least until the Lions are all done as well. So we want her to be ready to sail with King George V when King George V is completed, at which point Hood may get pulled in 37, 38, perhaps instead of Renown, and given a refit then. That's a potential way it could go. Or, as I said, they might just run her ragged as a flagship, the way she was historically. Architect096 asks, would it be more beneficial for the British Empire during the Washington Naval Treaty to have Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, maybe even India, allocated their own tonnage for ships including capital ships, and if so, how would their inclusion change the treaty? Would the US and Japan agree to it, or would they be against it, and how would this version of the treaty affect World War II? Realistically, the US and Japan are never going to agree to Britain getting, in on the 553 agreement and all of its colonies and dominions, or at least the bigger ones, getting their own tonnages, because, well, simply put, the legal perspective in 1922 would be that if Britain went to war, so did everybody else in the empire, at which point the US would not be getting parity with Britain, because they would know that if they went to war with Britain, Britain would be able to legally summon all of its allies' fleets, and the Japanese would just be going, well, that's just silly, because for similar reasons, except even more overwhelming odds. So the only way that they're going to agree to it would be if Britain agreed to take a commensurate cut in its own ship allocations, which Britain is definitely not going to want to do. The Royal Navy being smaller than the US Navy in the early 1920s, no way Britain's going to hear of that. I mean, it was a little bit of a struggle to get some people just to accept parity, let alone being a smaller navy. So that's the realistic side of things. However, if you want to go, full optimist, best possible outcome for the British, and for some reason the US and Japan agree to Britain getting its equality with the US, but the other colonies also getting their own tonnages, then maybe they do this by demanding that those countries be given independence much, much earlier, well, a decade or so earlier than Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc. in theory get with the Westminster Proclamation. India obviously a little bit later, but maybe they say, okay, well, you have to kind of break these guys off as their own separate country in reality. I mean, that's not going to change all that much going forward into World War II, because as we know, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc., they came to fight alongside Britain anyway of their own free will. But that, in an extremely optimistic setting, might be enough to assuage American and Japanese concerns, at which point it is going to affect World War II to a degree, because it obviously means that when Britain goes to war and calls on its allies to come help it, it's going to have a slightly larger number of ships to do so with. So the Australians are probably still going to end up decommissioning HMAS Australia, because the infrastructure to support a 12-inch gun warship isn't there anymore, and the Australians in the early 20s are also looking at budget cuts. But instead of maybe getting Australia and Canberra, the county class that they historically did, the Royal Navy might say to the Australians, well, if you save your money for a few years, we'll give you Tiger and our entire stock of 13.5-inch shells. They might do that. And similarly with other areas like Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, etc., the Royal Navy can take the opportunity, in theory, to ask for continuations of construction on their newer ships whilst gently releasing some of their older but still capable vessels to these other navies. So the D class, the E class, they might retain some C class for anti-aircraft cruiser conversion. Who knows, the York class might get a longer production run if some of the countries want brand new ships. But essentially you would probably have, various not colonial navies at that point, holding a mixed bag of, Leander, Arethusa, York diminutives of modern ships, plus some of the newer but still older ships, D class, E class, maybe even Hawkins class, which in turn means the Royal Navy has a few more counties, a few more Leanders, a few more towns floating around, and they can all band together as one big happy family, and maybe, who knows what happens with a potential 1930s refit of the HMAS Tiger at that point. So yeah, it would give them a bit more punch and a little less stretched very thinness going forward. Although that does make it very likely that HMAS Tiger would be wandering around the Guadalcanal campaign, which I can imagine would be quite interesting. Robert Knapp asks, how capable were the Sverdlov-class cruisers, and how do they compare to their Western naval equivalents? Also, why did they play such an outsized role in Western naval strategy early in the Cold War? So, the Sverdlovs, they're pretty decent as cruisers. They essentially fall into the same category as the Baltimores fill for heavy cruisers, i.e. that is, they have the armament and the speed of a treaty-era cruiser, in the Baltimore's case heavy and Sverdlov's case light, except that because they don't have the restrictions of the treaty, they can be built up to the size that's necessary for them to then also carry a reasonable secondary armament, anti-aircraft armament, radar, etc., 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 which means that your common or garden Sverdlov comes in at something between 13.5 and 14,000 tons instead of 10,000, despite, not actually having dramatically all that much firepower than, say, a Cleveland or HMS Belfast. The difference is, of course, they've got all the capacity for it. Now, why they play such an outsized role in Western naval strategy early in the Cold War is because they are immediately post-war cruisers, so they're brand new, and the Soviets are building a lot of them. They don't build as many as they say they're going to, but they still have, over a dozen in service at any one time. And this is a little bit concerning for the Western Allies because essentially the only two navies left with large cruiser fleets, at least in theory at this point, are the US and Royal Navies. But most of the US Navy's remaining cruiser force, because they've decommissioned and put into reserve the vast majority of their cruisers, an awful lot of the US Navy's cruiser force is over in the Pacific, not huge numbers of them in the Atlantic, and the Royal Navy's cruiser force has also been massively downsized. The only counties that are still around by the 50s are training ships, so they're not, viable anymore. And as far as light cruisers go, the Leanders are gone, the Arethusas are gone. Obviously, there's been wartime losses to the town class. There are a handful of towns still around, but apart from Belfast, they've pretty much all lost X-turrets, so they're down to 9 guns. There's the Crown Colonies, or Fijis, depending on what you want to call them. They were all 9-gun designs, pretty much to start with, and, therefore, you're looking at a range of cruisers that are largely due to be decommissioned due to age and or cost cutting by the end of the 50s or sold on. And apart from Belfast, none of the Royal Navy cruisers that are still around can realistically take on a Sverdlov in a straight-up gunfight, because whatever qualitative differences there may be in specific radar and fire control systems, the fact is the Sverdlov is close enough, and it's, or in some cases superior, and it's got 25% more firepower. Well, a third more firepower if you're going 33% if you're going from 9 guns up to 12 guns, or if you're from the Sverdlov's perspective, 25%. And part of it was the fact that the Allies, for obvious reasons, had gone in a big way for carriers and their escorts. But the problem was that whilst carriers had sort of become king and attained primacy over the battleship, there was the fact that the Soviet Northern Fleet, which is where a lot of the Sverdlovs were going to be operating from, would have been coming in from the Arctic Ocean into the high North Atlantic and the upper ends of the North Sea. And whilst carriers had been getting bigger and carrier aircraft had been improving, there was still a large number of carrier aircraft that couldn't operate at night, and the weather in the areas where the Sverdlovs were likely to operate could also quite often negate the ability to operate carrier aircraft, which suddenly made surface warships considerably more viable in that combat theatre than, say, in the middle of the Pacific, without significant amounts of air support or their own carriers. And that all led to a slight problem, because if the Royal Navy wanted to take on Sverdlovs, in a case of where the Royal Navy's cruisers could meet a Sverdlov and reasonably expect a 1v1 victory, that would mean the Royal Navy would have to start building new cruisers. And for the US Navy, it would mean they'd have to start recommissioning some of their heavy cruisers or reassigning the Worcesters for as long as they were intact, etc. And yeah, if you're trying to maintain a large enough cruiser fleet to take on a dozen Sverdlovs and maintain a large carrier fleet, etc., etc., that can be something of a problem, which is one of the reasons why I think decommissioning HMS Vanguard was a dumb idea, because Vanguard's stated role towards the end of her career was basically a Sverdlov killer, which she could do really, really well. The option taken up instead of keeping Vanguard around, which was to keep 2 cruisers around, yeah, that's not going to work anywhere near as well. And now we have a little bit of a special case. So you may remember in an earlier Drydock a few weeks ago, somebody asked, how did the photographer get to take that photo of USS Washington engaging Hiroshima? Who was it? Where were they, etc., etc. And here's the photo in question. Well, we were very, very lucky, because one other subscriber, Pedden Harley, used his question entry to tell us that he actually went over to USS North Carolina, of course, USS Washington's sister ship, and stood around on the bow with a copy of this photo for reference, and started pointing his camera to see what he could find. Now, obviously, North Carolina doesn't have her gun turrets trained to port, so it's not going to be a perfect match, but he did send this photo. And allowing for the fact that his camera isn't shooting in exactly the same aspect ratio as the 1940s camera, you can see that the superstructure is pretty much in the right place and near enough at the right height. The anchor chains are, in fact, all in the right place, and you've even got the 320mm Oerlikons in place as well. In fact, as you can see on screen now, with just a tiny bit of an aspect change, you pretty much have exactly the shot. You can see the superstructure lining up there perfectly along with the anchor chains, and the 20mm Oerlikons are just in fractionally different locations. But then again, they were installed post facto on 2 different ships, so the fact they may be in slightly different locations doesn't make a huge amount of odds. And it also answers the question of how on earth the photographer managed to get to this position without, being blown over the side by the turrets or clonked on the head by a 16-inch gun. Because if you take a couple of steps back, you see this little hatch in the bottom left here. You're basically standing right next to that hatch. In fact, on the bottom right, you can see a series of footprints in the early morning mist, or dew, that's collected on the ship, which is where he was standing a moment ago taking the previous photo. So, almost certainly to take that photo, the engagement has kicked off, and the photographer's run along inside the ship, popped up through that hatch, and that's how he's taken the photo. So there you go, a little bit of a live photographic archaeology taking place courtesy of Pedden Harley. HNOMS Schleswig Jaguiberi, I think. Oh, you are trying to torture me, aren't you? Asks, what was the most heavily protected river gunboat or river monitor? That's going to be a bit of an interesting one, because it depends on how you quantify the protection that you're measuring. Because if you want to go by absolute thickness, you're probably looking at one of the American Civil War era river monitors, because of course, using iron, they're going to end up having to carry a lot thicker metal, even if its effective protection is less than thinner plates on some of the later monitors in various places. And then if you want to look at total absolute, what was the best protected, as in what was the absolute thickest amount of armor ever found on a river monitor, that's again going to be, well, it won't be an American Civil War monitor, but it'll probably be one of the latter 19th or early 20th century European river monitors, looking at their turrets, because some like Lyther had fairly hefty turrets with a decent amount of protection on them. But if you want to look at side armor and or deck armor, then that's going to change things over again. So for something like that, you would probably be looking at a Koros class river monitor, like this Austro-Hungarian one here, albeit that river monitors didn't tend to carry huge amounts of armor outside of occasionally turrets, because they wanted to preserve shallow draft as much as humanly possible. So this type of monitor, for example, only has just under an inch of deck armor and 2 inches of side armor, but a very, very low profile. Now, 2 inches of modern steel armor is still more effective than 6 inches of iron armor, which you'd find on an American river monitor, but is obviously only 1/3 as thick if you want to go for the absolute thickness. Paul from Chicago asks, what did copper plating do to the metacentric height of warships? After copper plating became common, did ship designers plan for the additional weight? That's a very good question, actually, because, of course, all this copper plating, thin as it is going to add weight to the ship. However, you have to remember that the copper plating was, for the most part, installed on wooden ships, although later on also on some ironclad ships with a wooden planking layer in between, after they discovered that nailing copper to iron and sticking it in salt water was not perhaps the best recipe for hull longevity. But nonetheless, with most wooden vessels, you have to remember that wooden ships are massively more buoyant than they would appear when they're in the water. But they carry huge amounts of ballast to both keep them from riding too high to become unstable, and also because obviously they've got a lot of ironwork once they become full gunnery vessels. There's a huge amount of ironwork up top, which means that, believe it or not, in its default condition, if you took all the ballast out of a wooden ship of the line but left the guns in, it would ride really high and then roll over and sink, Mary Rose style. So with all that ballast in the bottom to basically weigh the ship down so that it doesn't do that, if you add a bunch of copper sheeting, like you can see here on Cutty Sark, then all you would do is take out an equivalent amount of ballast in weight from the hold of the ship, and the overall weight distribution of the ship is pretty much maintained. Peter Guy asks, in several of your previous videos, we've gone through how the firing of a battleship's primary armament would sound and feel like on the deck outside the turret, potentially with fatal results at certain angles. But do you know how unpleasant the firing of such a gun would be inside the turret? I can't imagine it was like a feather hitting a pillow. Was it worse in the pre-Dreadnought days versus, say, the Iowa class days? Well, it certainly wouldn't have been pleasant, and regardless of what gun you're firing, there is going to be a certain amount of shock transmitted through the gun itself, through the barrel, through the breech, etc., which is going to affect people internally. However, the vast majority of the sound, and of course pretty much all of the pressure, is going to be coming out of the muzzle, at least assuming the gun is functioning properly. And yes, it was worse in the pre-Dreadnought days compared to the Iowa class days, and that's for two primary reasons. Firstly, that back in the pre-Dreadnought days, and even in World War I, the only real way to protect your hearing that you would have would either be to clamp your hands over your ears if you weren't doing something that required your hands at the time the gun fired, or, which most people tended to do, just stick lumps of cotton wool in your ears and hope for the best. Whereas by the time the Iowa was coming into service in World War II, there were early forms of more proper hearing protection involved, and certainly by the time you got to the 1980s, when the Iowa was back in service for the last time, there was definitely what we would count today as modern hearing protection available. But there is also another major factor, and that is the proximity of the main source of the pressure and blast, which is the muzzle. Because if you're, say, firing an Iowa-class battleship, you'll remember that kind of vaguely pear-shaped or almond-shaped pressure profile that I've posted several times in different dry docks. For an Iowa class, if you're standing parallel with the breech of the gun, all that blast and pressure, etc., is being chucked out of the muzzle that's 67 feet away from you, which obviously then is going to have to travel backwards, which we know, it doesn't do anywhere near as well as forwards, and then come in through the opening in the front of the turret and into the turret where it will impact you. Compared to, let's say, a 12-inch 35 caliber gun, which is a fairly common gun of varying descriptions by varying manufacturers during the early pre-dreadnought eras, and if you're in the same position next to the breech, the barrel end and the muzzle is only 35 feet away, which means that the amount of pressure, although the total pressure wave coming out of it is obviously going to be a little bit less than with the amount of explosive from a 16-inch 50, it's also about twice as close, which, that's going to make a rather large difference because, of course, explosive power, blast, etc. dissipates according to the square cube law. And that means that although a 12-inch 35 uses considerably less propellant than a 16-inch 50, it doesn't use less enough to actually have the overall blast effect that reaches back to the people in the turret be less because of that massive decrease in distance. It will still actually hurt a little bit more. Michael Gilson asks, in aviation, there are aerospikes that allow a blunter airframe to function like a more streamlined airframe, although they're more commonly used with munitions than manned vehicles. Is there any kind of nautical equivalent which would allow you to keep your beam to length ratio after you've widened your beam without installing a new full-on lengthened bow or stern? There are a few tricks to reduce your overall apparent resistance through the water depending on what exactly it is you're trying to do, and in this case, something like bulging or something seems to be what you're talking about. Now, the nautical version, at least for battleship speeds, which would be most similar to an aerospike, i.e. reduces resistance whilst travelling through the water at a given speed, would just be the bulbous bow. Although that doesn't reduce your resistance by, fooling the water into thinking that you're a different shape. It just causes destructive interference between the bow wave that the bulbous bow causes and the bow wave that your bow actually causes. So that's one thing. But another way, which perhaps more directly addresses the latter part of your question about maintaining an apparent beam to length ratio despite having a wider beam than you'd strictly want for that ratio, is the transom stern, which you can see here with HMS Vanguard. The transom stern, this sort of very sharp 90-degree cutoff, essentially creates a phantom regular stern as far as the hydrodynamics of the ship moving through the water is concerned, which can give you an apparent length as far as the ship is concerned for working out things like length to beam ratio, that on a battleship scale might be 30, 40, 50 foot more than the ship actually physically measures, which will obviously then give you an artificially better length to beam ratio for working out things like your overall resistance and therefore your top speed. So if you were, for example, increasing your weight by either widening the ship or sticking some bulges on or something, then assuming that you weren't going to lose anything too dramatic, you could, in theory, chop several hundred, if not a couple of thousand tons off of your stern, and that would obviously make your ship lighter and physically shorter, but maintain or possibly even extend your actual length to beam ratio. Lincoln Locker asks, I've recently run across the US Navy's experimentation with gyroscopic stabilizers fitted to ships such as USS Warden and USS Henderson. Did other nations experiment with them as well, and did they reach the same conclusions as the US Navy? There were various small-scale and small-ship experiments with gyroscopic stabilizers across a number of navies in the early 1900s through to the 1920s, and some on slightly larger naval vessels, obviously the Henderson being the first big one. However, what was very quickly found was that they worked the best if you had them mounted on, or in the case of multiple stabilizers, adjacent to the ship's center of rotation, which, makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, depending on which ship you're looking at, most warships of the time had their center of rotation usually occupied by something like machinery spaces, usually, and occasionally magazines or barbettes, which were generally held to be better uses of such space by the ship than random big lumps of spinning metal, which kind of put the kibosh on the idea for most large warships. And obviously then you had the advent of other things like bilge keels and everything to help dampen out rolling. So, that's the conclusion the US Navy came to, and it's the conclusion that pretty much all the other navies came to as well. Whilst gyroscopic stabilizers would have some benefits on ships that weren't necessarily going to have to fight on the front lines, so transports, etc., for instance, the simple fact of the matter was that the need for such stabilization was also considerably less on transports and the like, because, as long as the tanks are fairly well locked down and, all the bread and the cheese and the preserved meats are all locked down, frankly, nobody except for the crew themselves really particularly cares if a supply ship or a tanker is bobbing up and down like a cork in a storm. Whereas, the stabilization is much, much, much more beneficial for a ship that needs a nice steady platform for its gunnery control solution, for example. JT Daily Update asks, I recently came across a USNI proceedings from 1925 which details how HMS Hood set multiple records for the time period in July 1924 during the Empire cruise as the largest vessel to pass through the Panama Canal and also the highest toll paid for a single vessel at the time, as the US Treasury was paid $23,339.50. These days I can bet you any Panama transiting ship would kill to have to pay that rate. My question is, do you have any insight on how this toll was paid? Did the US bill the UK afterwards, or did they require payment up front before traversing the canal? Because if the latter is true, I can't get the image out of my head of the entire crew complement on the ship trying to search around for loose change because somebody thought it would be a good idea to shortchange the Royal Navy and only allocate $20,000 for the passage. Well, here she is doing just that. Now, to my understanding, and bear in mind this is to my understanding because I'm not 100% au fait with the intricate workings of the Panama Canal billing process throughout history, but from what I've gathered from looking at other accounts of ships passing through the canal zone, at least warships, when they completed their passage, because obviously these ships are acting on behalf of a state, the captain would be presented with a total bill, which he then had to sign off as an authorized representative of the state, and then that money would be recovered more directly from the government in question rather than from the warship itself. At least that's what I seem to have inferred from various descriptions of warships going through in the period. In fact, well, from 1924 going forward almost 2 decades to when HMS Victorious was passing through the canal, because the canal hadn't quite been designed with large aircraft carriers in mind, and they weren't particularly used to it. They did do a reasonable degree of property damage on the way through, the overhanging flight deck knocking out lamp columns and so forth. And they were presented with a slightly larger than average bill, which the captain just apparently signed Lend-Lease on the bottom of it, since, of course, Victorious was being brought through the canal at the behest of the US authorities, who were also trying to charge him for having done various bits of damage to the canal on his way through. Luke Murphy asks, as I understand it, USS New York BB-34 initially survived the Bikini Atoll test, but was subsequently sunk as a target ship in airstrikes off of Hawaii. Has the wreck ever been discovered, and if so, is it possible for divers to visit? As far as I'm aware, the wreck of New York hasn't been precisely located. I know the wreck of Nevada was relatively recently located, which was another Bikini Atoll survivor then sunk in Sink-X. But I don't think anyone's actually come across the final resting place of New York. With that said, even if they did, given the approximate location that New York was sunk, at the very minimum, she's going to be 1.5 miles to 2 miles down, at maximum like 4 or 5 miles down. So, yeah, you're not visiting that wreck anytime soon as a diver, unless it's as, fish bait. You could go down there via mini-sub, although obviously there are some inherent risks to that. But, I don't think anyone's going to be likely to visit the wreck of New York anytime soon, even if they find it. The previous USS New York is much more accessible because that's in Subic Bay in the Philippines. Riva asks, regarding carrier aviation, was there anything technological beyond innovation that stood in the way of the later developments in carrier technology happening earlier? Could the first attempts have been flat-top carriers with islands or even angled flight decks from the word go, or were there speed bumps in the way, and if so, how were they addressed? Sort of yes and no. There's nothing particularly technologically innovative about a large flat deck, or even one with an island, but the specific configuration that you see with aircraft carriers eventually working out as, large flat deck with a island to starboard, that's not requiring a technological innovation, that's requiring an understanding of the aerodynamics involved as relates to the relatively newfangled invention of the aeroplane. Because, in theory, yes, you could have had starboard island, otherwise open flat flight deck right from the very start. There's nothing that would stop you from building a carrier like that in the middle of the First World War, except for the apparent need for it. And it's only when you have various carriers like Furious and other early attempts having large amounts of turbulence issues that people start realizing, maybe we should minimize and relocate that island. And even after realizations like that, you still have various wind tunnel experiments like were done in the run-up to building HMS Eagle and HMS Argus, where they were looking at things like, should we have an island on either side with gantries in between to create a tunnel? Will that kind of create a smooth airflow? Turns out, actually, no, it'll do the exact opposite. But they didn't know that at the time. So that's sort of a scientific innovation rather than a technological innovation. With angled flight decks, again, there's not a huge amount to stop you having an angled flight deck right from the word go. It's it's an overhang. It's an overhang that will need a little bit of counterbalance, but that's pretty much par for the course with aircraft carriers anyway. The main thing that's stopping angled flight decks being generated that much earlier is need, because the angled flight deck comes in as a way to allow you to safely conduct takeoff and recovery operations with jet aircraft and other, more recent high-speed aircraft. Other minor advantages, like slightly increased deck space for parking aircraft, are relatively superfluous when you're talking about piston engine aircraft for the most part. So again, you could have an angled flight deck carrier in 1916, but there's absolutely zero need for one. Some things like the landing system, the gyroscopically stabilized light bars and dots, that would need technological advancement in the realm of small-scale gyrostabilization, etc. But that's not a huge thing to overcome once you know what you're actually trying to do. Honestly, outside of a few systems like obviously radar and steam catapults and such like, the vast majority of features you see in, say, a carrier of the mid to late 50s could theoretically have been built with the technology of the time in the late 1910s. It's just that for the vast majority of them, as you probably surmised, the need for them just wasn't perceived, or there just flat out wasn't that need yet. So a lot of carrier innovations in the 20s, 30s, and even 40s are mostly adaptations to new requirements rather than a requirement that was always there, with a few exceptions like the the landing system, which would have been useful from the start. And finally, Camino John asks, in a somewhat recent Patreon Drydock, you answered a question about running powder up from the magazine on age of sail ships. This got me thinking, given the different sizes of guns ranging from 6-pounders all the way up to 42-pounders on some ships, were there numerous sized bags of powder? And beside keeping the right size bags flowing to the correct guns, how did they have enough ready-use powder for an engagement? Were they pre-measured and packed away in casks? Was there a limited amount of ready use, and as action progressed, were people busy filling fresh bags? It seems to me that people filling fresh bags would almost certainly lead to stray powder being on the outside and bags not having a uniform weight. So obviously it would vary slightly on the Navy, but generally speaking, most ships would have several magazines. So there would always be a main magazine, great magazine, whatever you want to call it. But quite often, especially on larger ships and even on smaller ships like a fifth rate, you would have a forward and an aft magazine. One of those might be your main one, but the other one would obviously help supply powder to whichever guns were nearest to it, as opposed to having to perhaps traverse the whole length of the ship. And at times, obviously, you could allocate powder for certain guns to certain magazines if you wanted to, if you had enough of them, but the magazines always have to be below the waterline, so you're not going to have, a magazine up on the upper gun deck of a three deck first rate ship of the line. But you've also got to remember the speed that most battles are developing at. Between sighting your enemy and the battle starting, you might have half an hour, or in the case of Battle Trafalgar, even a day or two, which means that, yes, there will be a certain amount of ready-use ammunition, ready-use charges at this point, really, ready to go, and they would be of different sizes and often also of different colours, or at least have some kind of colour indicator, as you'll see coming up in a minute from these pictures taken from the magazine of USS Constitution. And for ready-use stuff, as you can see back there on the left-hand side of this picture, they would also often be stored within their own cases. So that is a case, for example, for a charge for a 24-pounder gun, i.e. the guns on the Constitution's main gun deck, or only gun deck since she's a frigate. And that is obviously what would be used up first. However, if you sight an enemy, let's say, you're on HMS Victory and you know that there's a battle coming, and you know that battle's coming whenever we catch the Franco-Spanish fleet, but it's going to be a while, then maybe a couple of hours before battle starts, people in the magazines might start filling some of the spare bags they've got left. Because, well, then you're building up a bunch of ready-use gunpowder that is going to be in use pretty soon. I mean, obviously, once they load the guns on a ship like Victory, that's 104 cannon plus a couple of carronades, so that's at least 106 charges which will have left the magazines, and they're going to need to be replaced if nothing else. So you've got the pre-battle action to be able to fill up fresh charges, and if the battle goes on for hours and hours and hours, then yes, you would end up in a position where you would have to be filling up more charges from the powder barrels, which could come in different shapes and sizes and capacities for obvious reasons. But when it came to that, you had very specific set procedures and set scoops which would allow you to measure precise set amounts, like you can see here, for your charges. So whilst, yes, on the face of it, you might think, if you're having to load in the middle of battle, that could lead to, stray powder and uneven amounts of charge. Well, you've got to remember, for one thing, we're talking about age of sail ship cannon. If you were an ounce or two under or over on your charge, it's probably not going to make that much difference in your broad accuracy terms. But as long as you follow procedure, you were pretty likely to get near enough spot on anyway, because they thought of this in advance, and so you had the capability, thanks to all of these various tools and more, like in the picture, to be able to turn around and go, oh, I'm just measuring out a standard amount of powder, and that's what's going in. Because bear in mind, again, it's a relatively speaking slow exercise. If battles are lasting hours, even the absolute best gunners are not unleashing a couple of salvos a minute. You're talking about, on a British ship, maybe a salvo or broadside every minute and a half to 2 minutes, and somewhat longer than that on Franco-Spanish ships. And all of that fighting is happening way above you because you're below the waterline by a considerable margin in relative calm and quiet. So you can take that extra second or two to be very precise and careful about exactly how much powder you load and where you load it and how you hand it off to the people who are going to then take it up through the ship. And that concludes this week's Patreon Drydock. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And in fact, this month's Patreon Drydock. We shall see you all again, if you reach this far, in another video going forward. And, well, it's very likely to be a bit shorter than this one was. Anyway, bye.